Did you know? Blaziken was the first Hoenn Pokemon. Not only that, but it was intentionally created to make players stick it in a PC box. According to Gen 3 art director Ken Sugimori, I thought about how wide the variety of Pokemon could be, and wanted to push the envelope of what would be accepted. So the first one I made was Blaziken. I wondered if people would go for such a humanoid Pokemon. I was intentionally testing the waters. Over the years, we've developed an image of what a Pokemon looks like, but this time we decided to push those boundaries and weaken the idea of what can't be a Pokemon. Ruby and Sapphire was about taking on new inspirations for Pokemon unlike anything we used before. Blaziken was in fact one half of this Pokemon, which was designed early in development and appears to have been split in two, with the other half becoming Latias. Just like Charizard in Gen 1, Blaziken was created first, then its pre-evolutions were designed by working backwards. Ken Sugimori went on to say that Torchic is based on painted chicks. Back when he was a kid, it was pretty common to see them for sale at fairs and festivals. Parents bought them in the same way they might buy a goldfish, sort of like a toy they don't actually have plans to care for long term. When a painted chick grew up and wasn't cute anymore, a lot of kids would just throw them out like a broken toy. Sugimori said, "I think people from our generation have certainly experienced buying painted chicks. So this one's orange, and just like a real painted chick, it starts out cute, then grows into something fierce and hard to look at. We wanted to recreate that experience, which led to Torchic, Combusken, and Blaziken. We wanted people raising them to feel that sense of disappointment, while also acquiring something more powerful. So if you're the kind of kid who didn't like what your starter grew into and shoved it in a PC box, you're like the Japanese kids of Sugimori's generation who threw out their painted chicks. But if you kept Blaziken in your party, you're probably a pretty good pet owner." This tale of Hoenn's Firestarter comes from a 2003 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine, which featured a 9-page interview we recently translated into English. Inside these exclusive translations, we found lots more info not previously known to Western fans, like that Ruby and Sapphire weren't originally planned to include any Pokemon from past generations. Game Freak eventually used this strategy to make Gen 5 feel like a soft reboot, but the idea initially started with Gen 3. Sugimori said, "The goal was to make something that felt new. A lot of people said that not much had really changed in Gen 2, and we kept wondering why that was. And I think it's because there were too many familiar Pokemon appearing in Gold and Silver. The first Pokemon you encountered was a Pidgey, and while nostalgia's fine and all, I wanted to draw lots of new Pokemon." The game's director Junichi Masuda was also present in that interview, and said, "From the early stages of development until past the halfway point, we planned on Ruby and Sapphire featuring nothing but brand new Pokemon. Since Ruby and Sapphire weren't compatible with the earlier Game Boy games, there would have been no way to trade Kanto and Johto Pokemon up to Gen 3. Well, at least not until Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Pokemon Colosseum released a year later. This would have made Gen 3 a pretty hard reboot, even more so than Gen 5 where old Pokemon could still be found in the post-game. But Game Freak ultimately decided to scrap the Hoenn reboot idea due to balancing issues. Basically, there just weren't enough Pokemon of certain elemental types, so they peppered in older Pokemon to quote fill the gaps. But because the change was made fairly late in development, the game's origins as a reboot still ended up leaving some pretty significant impacts on Ruby and Sapphire's final builds. For one thing, it explains why there's so many new Pokemon in Gen 3, and also why older Pokemon make up such a small percentage of the Hoenn dex. And according to Sugimori and Masuda, it's also why you see nothing but brand new Pokemon until after you've made it past the third town, because originally, it was all supposed to be a Pokemon reboot. The scrapped reboot idea is also the reason some of the new Pokemon exist in the first place. As Sugimori explains it, when we decided to have only new Pokemon in these games, it became necessary to make Pokemon that fill the same role as Pidgey, and make a weak caterpillar Pokemon like Caterpie. For some people, Ruby and Sapphire will be their first Pokemon game, and showing them a caterpillar turning into a cocoon, then a butterfly, is the easiest way to introduce the concept of evolution, so we intentionally made Wurmple to be like Caterpie, but a little different. In other words, Pokemon like Wurmple and Tailo would have never existed if Gen 3 hadn't spent a chunk of its development as a reboot. Other Pokemon came into existence by working backwards from their names. Game Freak came up with the names Zigzagoon and Slackoff, and thought they were so hilarious they just had to design Pokemon around them. Their names are essentially the same in both Japanese and English, by the way, with Zigzagoon coming from Zigzag Raccoon, and Slackoff derived from Slackoff and Sloth. Then, the design team gave them families based on themes. Sugimori said, Slackoff goes from a sloth to being motivated, then deciding it wasn't worth it after all. Then the raccoon goes from being a zigzag to a straight line, which is how they got Linoon. 15 years later, Sword and Shield's art director James Turner continued that theme with an obstacle-based Pokemon. James posted all this art on Twitter just in case some fans didn't catch the wordplay. Just as their initial idea to exclude old Pokemon was a reaction to fans' criticism of Gold and Silver being too been there done that, the actual designs of Hoenn's Pokemon were very much a response to criticism of Gen 2 as well. According to Sugimori, Gold and Silver had a lot of kiddie designs, and some fans were starting to say Pokemon had become too babyish, so one theme for Ruby and Sapphire was returning to the coolness of the monsters. We added more and more cool, tough-looking, and monstrous Pokemon, which is exemplified by Groudon. Sugimori also says his team broke free of limitations hoisted upon them by the anime and merchandising sides of the business. When they made Gen 2's Pokemon, they kept the design simple so they'd be easier to animate in the cartoon, and also cheaper to make toys out of. But for Gen 3, Sugimori said, quote, "Screw it." As an example, he points to the complex lines covering Groudon and explains that his new attitude definitely resulted in Groudon and lots more Pokemon looking cooler than if he was still restrained by the anime and merchandise. But for Gen 3, there was another restriction on the design team that most fans probably would never have expected. Here's how Sugimori explained it. A lot of the Pokemon had a troubled development. Like at one point I said, "The tail on that Pokemon was annoying me, so I got rid of it." Then someone else shot back, "What? But I already programmed in some tail moves." So we had some constraints where we couldn't get rid of a Pokemon's tail, and as a result we had to change their shape or find some other workaround. He goes on to say the same thing happened with Pokemon's horns, where he wanted to get rid of them later in development, but couldn't because other developers already gave them horn moves. We were curious who he might have been talking about, so here's all the Pokemon in Gen 3 who learn tail moves by leveling up. We think the most likely culprits are Lairon and Aggron. They're pretty easy to imagine without their tails, and they can both learn the attack Iron Tail. Interestingly, their pre-evolution Aron can also learn Iron Tail, even though it doesn't have a tail. As for the Pokemon who weren't supposed to have horns, Ralts, Kirlia, and Shuppet fit the bill visually, but none of them have horn moves, so they couldn't be the ones Sugimori was talking about. In fact, not a single Pokemon added in Gen 3 can learn Horn Attack, Horn Drill, or Mega Horn, and the ones who can learn Peck all have beaks. So honestly, we're a bit puzzled which Pokemon might have had their horns on the chopping block, so let us know in the comments if you've got a hunch. Speaking of unfinished Pokemon designs, Sugimori also says they sent early builds of Ruby and Sapphire to Nintendo for testing purposes. This included unfinished designs for lots of Pokemon. There's been quite a few leaks of Pokemon beta sprites in recent years, including a text-only Pokédex that described an early version of Rayquaza as the White Dragon Pokemon. But so far, there hasn't been a leak of the actual beta sprites. It seems there's at least 2 sets of beta sprites, the batch sent to Nintendo for testing, and a later batch used in a Japanese demo. About 4 months before Ruby and Sapphire released in Japan, Nintendo toured an event called Pokemon Festa around a few Japanese cities. Several screenshots were published showing slightly different designs for Pokemon like Sharpedo. But to this day, what else could be hiding inside those Festa demos remains a mystery. Maybe someday these 2 beta sprite sets will leak and we'll finally get a chance to see White Rayquaza, the Grass-type Sprinklermon, and countless more scrapped monster designs. Now let's talk about why the games are called Ruby and Sapphire. According to Masuda and Sugimori, part of the reboot concept was a desire to return to the series' roots, so they were looking for titles that could be represented by the colors red and blue to match the Gen 1 games. But beyond that simple concept, the details got pretty complicated because Game Freak staff couldn't agree on the exact titles, and some of the titles they could agree on were already trademarked by other companies. As a result, they didn't come up with the names Ruby and Sapphire until 4 months before the game's release date. The reason they picked those titles specifically was because the previous game was Crystal, and they wanted to continue the theme of crystals by using gemstones. By the way, if you've ever wondered why Crystal was named after a mineral instead of a color, Game Freak explains why in this Japanese magazine. Masuda says, Crystal's title came from the crystals used in electronic transmissions, so we picked a title that fit with the game's contents, with Sugimori adding, especially since Crystal was meant for the mobile system GB. They're talking about the internet features of Japanese Crystal, where you could hook up to a cell phone and battle and trade online, get news updates, and access a special event to catch Celebi. Back to Gen 3 though. So there's a type of crystal called corundum. Red corundum are called rubies, and every other color are called sapphires. Blue sapphires are the most valuable, and Game Freak thought the dual nature of corundum crystals seemed pretty clever, and also gave them the red and blue colors they were looking for. so they finally came to an agreement. But then the Pokémon Company actually objected, saying they didn't want more games named after crystals, but it was already super late in development, and ultimately they had little choice but to give it their blessing. As for the eventual third edition, green corundum do exist, but they don't have a special name. They're still just sapphires. So Game Freak picked another kind of crystal called an emerald. It's not a corundum, but it brought them back to their roots with Gen 1's colors of red, blue, and green, which was their initial goal from back when Gen 3 was planned as a reboot. Speaking of Gen 1, when the interviewer asked Masuda where Hoenn's located in relation to Kanto and Johto, he basically said they aren't connected. Quote, "I think it's more fun to think of them as separate worlds. When we designed Hoenn, we also made a rocket launch pad, and we had ideas like maybe that's where Team Rocket came from. But we decided it was better not to spell things out concretely, especially as far as the media is concerned. In other words, even if that's how they thought of it in development, they didn't want to make it canon, probably so they had the freedom to change their minds at some point in the future." As Ruby and Sapphire's development was nearing completion, Masuda's wife went into labor with their first child. He rushed her to the hospital, but the games were in such a critical final stage of development, he kept getting messages on his phone asking to sign off on last-minute revisions. She was born in September, which, as Masuda notes on his blog, makes Sapphire her birthstone. Even as he held her for the first time, he could still hear emails arriving in his phone's inbox. Masuda named his daughter Kiri, and to commemorate her birth, secretly added her into the game. She's a young girl in Sootopolis City who gives away free berries, and unlike most NPCs, her name was left unchanged in the English localization. If you talk to her, she'll say her parents named her Kiri so she'd grow healthy and warm-hearted, and also says she was born in autumn, just like the real Kiri. But there was more to Gen 3 than just Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Pokemon's third generation featured over a dozen spin-off games, but we just want to focus on the big one, the series' first home console RPG, Pokemon Colosseum. Colosseum wasn't made by Game Freak, or even Pokemon fans at all. It was mostly made by a small team of top talent that Nintendo poached away from Sony. At the same time Game Freak was wrapping up development on Ruby and Sapphire, Nintendo spent about $1 million opening a new studio called Genius Sonority. The man they put in charge was Manabu Yamana, who up to that point was best known for directing Dragon Quest games, some of the most popular RPGs on PlayStation. Many of Colosseum's other core developers came over from Dragon Quest as well. In an interview on Nintendo's Japanese website, Colosseum's lead programmer said, "I hadn't played any GBA or GCN Pokemon games before we started. There actually wasn't a true Pokemon expert in the entire studio. But that didn't change our deadlines, haha." The Pokemon Company approached this brand new team of non-Pokemon fans and asked them to make the series' first 3D RPG. Thinking about what kind of game they wanted to make, they thought, well, most of the kids who played the original Pokemon games were about 11 years old. Gen 1 was a coming-of-age story, and these kids have been coming of age in the real world too. So let's make Colosseum's protagonists the same age as the fans who've been along for the ride since the very beginning. 6 years have gone by, and the fans are 17 now, so let's make the protagonists 17 as well. In that same Japanese interview, the game's concept lead, Akihiko Miura, said, "I wanted to produce a game that was different and also targeted a slightly older audience than previous Pokemon games. Therefore, the main characters are about 17 years old, and they wear a lot of dark-colored clothing. We wanted to make the hero into a kind of dark hero, someone that the gangs are actually afraid of. But as you go through the game, you'll learn that he's really not a bad person, even though he steals other trainers' Pokemon." Genius Sonority wanted a more mature setting to go along with their older protagonist, something totally different from every other Pokemon game. All the mainline games were set in lush environments based on Japan, so they decided on a dry, urban world in a desolate desert, so basically the opposite of what had come before. They created the Ore region and based it on Arizona, which made it the first Pokemon region based on the United States. According to composer Tsukasa Tawada, we actually tried to make a lot of the game resemble Phoenix, Arizona in a loose way. There's a city in Ore called Fenak, which was founded when the first mayor of the town drew water into the city. Fenak's origin story actually draws from the real-life lore of Arizona's capital city, Phoenix, which was founded when a guy named Jack Swilling had canals built to bring in water. The new canals followed an ancient canal system built by the Hohokam people, and the communities that sprung up were built on top of the Hohokam's ancient ruins. The city was born from the ashes of a former civilization, so they named it Phoenix. By the way, we know some fans pronounce it Or, but the only audible reference for the region's pronunciation is a TV commercial commercial where they pronounce it Ore, so we're gonna follow their lead.
Darkness has fallen over the land of Ore.
Back to the game though, you can even see a small piece of Arizona in the game's cutscenes. When Wes drives his motorcycle from one town to another, you can spot a rock form in the distance, but only for a brief moment. This appears to be an homage to the Mittens, two famous rock forms in Arizona. To us, it looks more like the West Mitten Butte, but it could also be the Eastern Butte seen from the opposite side. You can see the Mitten on Ore's horizon in several more cutscenes, but it's always so quick. Blink and you'll miss it. In issue 85 of the German magazine N-Zone, the game's director identifies one man as the visionary behind the Ore region, Shinichi Hiramoto. At the time, he was most famous for illustrating the Star Wars Return of the Jedi manga, and he'd later say that as a non-Pokemon fan, the only reason he was willing to join the Colosseum project was so he could introduce that grittier element into the world of Pokemon. A stylistic mismatch, cute Pokemon in a decaying world. The very existence of shadow Pokemon was his idea as well, along with how they looked. Very little concept art for Pokemon Colosseum was ever made public. In fact, there's only 3 pieces, and they can only be found in a limited edition strategy guide. That guide came bundled with an art book that's mostly just 3D renders, but also includes that rare concept art. We tried to find a copy for sale, but they're pretty hard to come by nowadays. So a big thanks to one of our viewers, Davo Gato, who scanned his copy for us. The first piece is Pyrite Town's initial concept, where the town's Colosseum was originally a raised planetary globe. And there's the Arizona Mitten right there, present from the very beginning. The next one appears to have been made later, showing a much more detailed version of Pyrite Town. In addition to the more mature plot and setting, Colosseum also catered to an older audience by being a lot more difficult than the mainline games. One detail that made Pyrite especially difficult was that it didn't have a Pokemon Center, but this concept art reveals it was originally designed to have one. Also, Pyrite's final build has a bridge that lets you cross the chasm, but it's missing from the concept art, with arrows indicating the only path to the Colosseum was through the long cave system packed with gang members. Otherwise, the concept art matches pretty closely with how Pyrite appeared in the final game. The only other piece of concept art is Myra B, one of the main villains, and still the only character in the entire series whose trainer class is Wanderer. Colosseum has one of the series' best soundtracks, which Tsukasa Tawada mostly wrote in just 10 days. Now, almost 20 years later, we recently got in touch with Tawada and asked about the time he spent in Ore. He said, "Not all the songs are inspired by Arizona, but some are, especially the harmonica solo music, which was clearly inspired by the dry air feeling, like a sandstorm in Phoenix, Arizona. Actually, I made some music which didn't get used in Colosseum or XD Gale of Darkness, but I'm not allowed to share it with you now. Hopefully, someday we'll get a chance to hear it. Although there's actually one piece of Colosseum music that did get released, but only in Japan. That's what you're hearing now. In fact, there's an entire virtual reality mode that fans in the West never got to experience, which unlocked a few Japan-exclusive shadow Pokemon. Those were the days when Nintendo was cross-promoting their hardware by encouraging fans to connect GameCubes with GBAs, and also connect their GBAs to scan e-reader cards. The Japanese e-reader cards unlock the VR mode and 3 difficulty settings. If you beat all 23 trainers on easy, you unlock one more who's got a Shadow Togepi you can catch. Beat them all on normal and you'll get a chance to catch Shadow Mareep. In hard mode, all the trainers are about as strong as the game's final boss, but even more difficult because there's 24 of them. If you can make it all the way to the end, Shadow Scizzor's your final prize. There was also a Japanese bonus disc that gave you a Celebi, and you could transfer it over to your Gen 3 games as well. Pretty much all this extra content is still on the disc in American versions of Pokemon Colosseum, and Nintendo already went through the trouble of localizing most of it into English. Unfortunately, all that content is artificially blocked off so you can't access it in-game. Those e-reader cards were never released internationally, but they could have just as easily made the Japanese VR mode accessible in the base game for free. Adding it all back in would be a great bonus for a modern-day re-release, like say on Nintendo Switch, where they could also make it widescreen and bump the resolution up to HD, a big upgrade from the GameCube's aging 480p. Colosseum got a sequel in 2005, Gale of Darkness, but the Ore series has been dormant ever since. No re-releases and no sequels. In 2016, Junichi Masuda was interviewed by the Spanish edition of Nintendo Official Magazine, who asked, "Here's a question that many fans who've been around since the beginning of the series have been wondering. Is there a possibility that we'll see, one day, a game in the style of Pokémon Stadium or Pokémon Coliseum?" Masuda replied with just one word: "No." And then he laughed. It seems Game Freak and the Pokémon Company aren't too interested in Ore nowadays, but there is still one man keeping a candle lit: Coliseum and XD's composer, Tsukasa Tawada. In 2017, he performed a live piano rendition of the Fenac City theme and uploaded it to his YouTube channel. And in 2021, he composed an arrangement of the Relic Forest theme. Even if everyone else has moved on, it's nice to know that at least one member of the team still has a place in his heart for the Ore region. Did you know? Pina Park was once part of Super Mario Sunshine's hub world and not a stage. Not only are there unused portals in the park that link to the Noki Bay and Pianta Village levels, but the park also has an object dictating where Mario lands after leaving a stage. Delfino Plaza has this same object for when players re-enter the hub. The area was likely recycled into a stage due to the game's rush development, which was hastily wrapped up to help sell GameCubes. Another unused idea seems to be that Yoshi was able to talk at one point. While footage doesn't exist, a drawing done by a correspondent of the UK's NGC magazine hinted that Yoshis could talk in footage shown to the press. Speaking of Yoshi, Sunshine was once planned to have a wearable Yoshi head for Mario that would spit out water. This was a concept developers thought about adding multiple times, and at one point they even considered having water shoot directly out of Mario's mouth. An unused Yoshi nozzle can still be found in the game's files, indicating this idea got further in development than previously thought. The game's director, Yoshiaki Koizumi, also wanted to include a water rifle for Mario, but felt it might cause age ratings issues in America. He was also afraid that consumers would see it as a gun, so some changes were made. Producer Takashi Tezuka stated, "Although we called it a water pistol, we tried to design it so that no associations could ever be made between it and actual weapons. So we were trying to design the weirdest and funniest gadget, which turned out to be a water tank you wear on your back." A pistol and a severed Yoshi head weren't the only ideas developers had for different flood attachments. They also considered having a nozzle resembling a firework or a sprinkler, but in the end scrapped them in order to fine-tune the 4 types of nozzles in the final game. Interestingly, the hover nozzle seems like it barely made it into the game. This is because the team felt it made the game too easy in some parts. In order to balance the game's difficulty, they removed FLUDD from the Mario action stages to give players more of a challenge. All in all, the team considered around 10 different nozzle attachments, meaning more than half of them were cut. One of these nozzles is actually referenced in unused text in the game's files. The so-called reverse nozzle, which the game points out as a temporary name, would have shot water behind Mario. The text also suggests it would give Mario a speed boost in races. It's possible this nozzle isn't just alluded to, but is still in the game's data under the title Dummy Nozzle. By loading the dummy nozzle through hacking, we can see what might have been. It's possible the idea was consolidated into the turbo nozzle, or was scrapped because it made aiming difficult. The unused text also suggests the reverse nozzle would break after some use, where it would be retrieved by a character named Rowney, who was possibly a human tourist that Mario would rescue. Cut dialogue also suggests the mayor would encourage Mario to help get a 5-star tourism rating for Delfino Plaza, possibly by cleaning up the plaza. The idea of using water in a Mario title came to Koizumi very early on. The team wanted to expand upon the options for the player, and used Mario's movement from Super Mario 64 as a base. When Koizumi first held the GameCube controller, he imagined using the right trigger as a water pistol, and the concept evolved from there. Koizumi wasn't the only one impressed with the GameCube controller. In a talk with Nintendo, Miyamoto stated, "Get accustomed to the GameCube controller because 10 years from now, this controller will be the standard." Ironically, in the game's re-release on the Switch 18 years later, Sunshine wouldn't be fully compatible with the GameCube controller. The graffiti system may have been the first feature in the game that Nintendo experimented with, going as far back as Mario 64. In an April 2002 Famitsu interview, Miyamoto stated, The game really started once we had the graffiti system. Actually, during Mario 64's development, we had a completely blank Goomba. We had a plan to let players paint a face on the Goomba. From there, we conducted a variety of experiments. This eventually led us to where we are now, where we have given the player a lot of freedom, and they can do things such as erasing the graffiti off the road in the town. Relics of the team's experiments can be found in the game's data, such as unused pollution maps. Some of these unused pollution maps included notes by the developers, while others are creepy images featuring enemies. One of these pollution maps even features the Japanese word for stupid written on it. When Koizumi first approached Tezuka and Miyamoto about his ideas for Sunshine, he was met with some resistance. Changing Mario's clothes was controversial, but in the end, the duo gave Mario a short-sleeved shirt. 15 years later, Koizumi would get his wish of giving the player more clothing options with Super Mario Odyssey. Sunshine would be a continuation of Koizumi's approach to sandbox gameplay in Mario games. This style, previously seen in Mario 64, is described as having the player explore a set environment while giving them an objective to complete. It was inspired by box gardens, or hakoniwa in Japan. Box gardens focus on creating a miniaturized landscape in containers, often creating a sense of realism within them. Koizumi would again return to this style with Mario Odyssey. In order to get the island aesthetic right, the team examined travel brochures and pictures from island resorts, and even invited travel agents to Nintendo to discuss the resort aesthetic. Koizumi stated that some employees even took it upon themselves to research tropical life by taking vacations in Southeast Asia on their own dime. Koizumi made some of his own contributions, like physically sculpting a clay model of Isle Delfino, which helped the team visualize the island and the locations within it. Looking at the sculpture, it seems there were several changes between how Koizumi initially envisioned the island and its final look. The airstrip may have been a separate landing pad originally south of Delfino Plaza, not northeast. The white marks on the clay model might also indicate that 10 levels were initially planned. Looking through the unused stage names, it seems there are several unused entries. One of them is called Scale Map, which could have been used for testing, or was a cut stage. There are also several entries that are reserved for levels, 19 in total. In an interview with Nintendo, Koizumi stated that Animal Crossing scriptwriter also helped write the dialogue for Delfino's residents. By comparing the staff role for the original Animal Crossing and Mario Sunshine, it seems this person was Makoto Wada, who also worked on series such as Star Tropics and Punch-Out! Possibly as an homage to Animal Crossing, a gyroid is present in the texture sheet for the waiting room, but is unused in the final game. Several colors of the Pianta tribe can also be found unused in the game's code. Most of the cut colors are similar to colors that were used, or are very dark-skinned. It's possible the team wanted to avoid any racial controversy, so the dark Piantas were removed from the game. Early screenshots of Mario Sunshine show some of the unused colors in action. Other ideas were scrapped during development. In trailer footage shown off at Space World 2001, a soccer ball can be seen in Isle Delfino. Looking through unused data for Sunshine, the soccer ball can be found along with a goal, which even has an animation for when the player scores. Between the trailer footage and unused animation, it's clear this idea got quite far into development. Miyamoto has stated, "Game creators in general are putting so many mini-games in games today. I'm concerned that they're spending too much energy on these extra features and not enough on the larger game." Exactly why it was cut is unknown, but Miyamoto's quote may suggest some extra content was trimmed from Sunshine in order to focus on the main game. There's also a secret yellow toad under Delfino Plaza that's loaded after unlocking Pina Park. By speaking to him, Mario will say, "Arrivederci," and a dialogue box will appear saying, "Mario, the princess was taken that way, across the river." Mario will instantly lose all his health and respawn after losing a life. This oddity was fixed in the PAL release. It seems that toads were planned to wear sunglasses at one point during development. An unused file named kinopio-sunmegane.bmd can be found in the game, with sunmegane meaning sunglasses. Speaking of sunglasses, when Mario is near water wearing his Shine Sprite shirt, his sunglasses do not appear in the reflection. Toads aren't the only objects hidden from the player's gaze. There are a bunch of bananas hidden above the sky over Delfino Plaza. The bananas can only be found by utilizing Yoshi's infinite flutter jump glitch. There are also some coconuts hidden in Pina Park underground, which normally can't be seen by the player. If Mario is able to move during the Pina Park cutscene, the Noki boy and Noki girl are missing body parts. Speaking of mistakes, error handlers are used in the game when the text that was meant to be displayed can't be found. In international versions of Sunshine, characters say, "Error, message could not be loaded" when there's a mix-up calling their dialogue. In the Japanese version, however, if a character's dialogue can't be brought up, they'll instead talk about the sunlight or their desire to eat some rice. In order to market the game, Nintendo pulled no stops for their main plumber. In the United States, Nintendo broke a Guinness World Record by serving the biggest plate of pasta ever. They gave out 3,265 pounds of pasta alla Mario in San Francisco, where Nintendo fans dressed as Mario dove into the pasta to find prizes, including a trip to Hawaii. Other regions had a tamer marketing plan. In Japan, Nintendo collaborated with Japan Rails by hosting a stamp rally, which rewarded players with one of 3 unique pin badges, or if they were lucky, a duffel bag sporting the Mario Sunshine logo. In Australia, Nintendo held several meet and greets with Mario, which was announced on their website by Charles Martinet as a disembodied Mario head.
Did you know? The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask actually has voice commands programmed into the game, and they still work. On March 1st, 2018, Nintendo 64 ROM hacker Zoinkity found voice commands programmed into the original Japanese release of the game. Just a day later, Zoinkity discovered the voice commands were programmed into all versions of Majora's Mask, including the GameCube re-releases. For years it was known that Majora's Mask's debug menu mentioned support for the voice recognition system add-on, but there'd been no proof the game ever actually used it until now. It appears a single byte of data is the only thing stopping the VRS from working. Once changed in the ROM, commands can be spoken into the voice recognition system just as they can in Hey You Pikachu. The commands are in Japanese in all versions. Okiro, Japanese for wake up, can be used to wake up Deku Scrubs. Ato Nanjikan, or how many hours left, can be asked of the Sheikah stones to tell the player the time. Then there's milk, which allows the player to gather twice as much milk from cows. Of course, this isn't the only secret surrounding the game. The game's original director, Eiji Aonuma, actually wasn't looking forward to remaking the game for the 3DS. Aonuma said, "It was one of those games where I was able to do quite a bit because I was much younger, so I didn't want to open that lid again." When Aonuma finally reopened the lid, he found decision after decision that made him think, what in the world? In fact, there were so many questionable decisions that Aonuma ended up making a what in the world list of features that needed to be tweaked or changed. When he gave the list to the 3DS design team, it was filled with confession-style apologies. One read, "At the time, I think there was something wrong with me." It's probably good that some ideas from Aonuma's younger days didn't make it into Majora's Mask. One idea considered was that Link would mark his hand to reflect the balance in his bank account. Aonuma recalled, "Maybe you could only see them if you shone a black light on them." This would sort of make sense in that he goes back in time but stays who he is. He retains everything that is part of his person. You could just look at your hand and say, "Oh yes, you were this person with this account and this is your balance." But the team realized there'd be some paradoxical issue no matter their approach. Ocarina of Time also had many obscure features that were changed before the final release. In 1997, Miyamoto was interviewed by Japan's Famemaga 64 magazine and revealed several details about Ocarina of Time that were different to the final game. Originally, Link would have had his speed slowed down as his health depleted. Only adult Link would have been able to use magic. Link would have been able to use staves as weapons. And Link would have been able to dash by pressing the B button when the game prompted it. The 3 spiritual stones were also intended to slot into the ocarina, which had 3 holes for this purpose. Miyamoto even said Shadow Link wouldn't be in Ocarina of Time, as it was a last-minute addition to Zelda 2. He also suggested that there be multiple horseback enemies, but the only enemy who rides a horse in the final game is Phantom Ganon. Yet one feature was always intended to make it in: the demon roosters. Miyamoto said, "We created this rooster so realistically, it's scary. He follows along just like a stalker. It would be bad if you bullied it. The Gerudo Fortress isn't accessible to Link when he's a child. However, an extra piece of heart can be found above Link's cell while in child form, and can only be obtained via cheats or glitches. The treasure chest that contains a piece of heart for adult Link instead holds an odd mushroom during the child era. Both of these discoveries imply that the fortress was originally explorable by child Link, and these objects can even still be found in the 3DS remake of the game. There's also unused files on Ocarina of Time's bonus disc, which was a pre-order bonus for the Wind Waker. The disc contains files alluding to The Legend of Zelda X, along with a logo for the title. Many believe that this was the bonus disc's original title. Twilight Princess went in a different direction to Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time. Rather than having details left out of the final game, details went into the game that are obsolete or difficult for a player to notice. For example, in most Zelda games, signposts can be chopped up with your sword. In Twilight Princess, the wooden pieces left over are programmed to float in water. What makes this detail interesting is that in the final game, there are no signposts located directly next to rivers, so to find it, players need to move the pieces to the river themselves. The feature took some time to implement, with Miyamoto jokingly saying, "This feature took us about the same time as it did to work on just one of the horses." Among Nintendo staff, Miyamoto is known to upend the tea table, meaning he demands large changes to a game towards the end of development. Aya Kyogoku, who was in charge for the overall script and some events for Twilight Princess, said players originally only spent one day in Ordon Village, the first location of the game. Kyogoku said, "Out of the blue, it was decided to make it 3 days. We got a sheet of paper with a specification plan written on it, a kind of Miyamoto-san's 3-day plan." According to Kyogoku, the team received the paper late in development, right after E3. The reason seemed to boil down to the Wii version of Twilight Princess not giving players much time to adapt to the radically new control scheme. If players only spent a small amount of time there before heading to more difficult parts, they might feel unprepared and get frustrated. Still, the effect of the decision was abrupt and intense. Programming, positions of characters, field design, all of the lines spoken by characters, and even several items in the village were altered. Kyogoku had to tell the European and American localization teams that the village was going to be completely changed, and not to translate anything before the changes were finished. But then, right when the team was finishing up, the tea table was upended again when it was decided to put another event into the game's story. Despite this, the team managed to get everything finished in time for release, including the localization staff. While the localizations for Breath of the Wild are largely the same between the Japanese and English versions of the game, some interesting changes were made. One difference is that the English localization team appears to have changed the motivation behind Ganon transforming into his Dark Beast form. In the English localization, it stated, "He has given up on reincarnation and assumed his pure, enraged form." This appears to directly contradict the Japanese version, which says, "This form was born from his obsessive refusal to give up on revival." This wasn't the only interesting difference. One change was made to the book The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Creating a Champion. In the Japanese version of the book, concept art of Link's family can be found in a transition page between book sections. This art shows Link's father, who is stated to be a knight in the game, and his sister. The English version of the book replaces this photo with a map, effectively region locking the art. There's another hint to Link's origins in Creating a Champion that may confirm a long-standing fan theory. In the entry for Hateno Village, it says Link's hometown may have been Hateno Village. The image accompanying the entry seems to imply that the vacant house for sale in the village once belonged to Link and his family. Of course, for a game as large as Breath of the Wild, there are many unused ideas. One of these appeared at the Game Developers Conference in 2017. There, several Breath of the Wild developers gave a presentation about breaking the conventions of the Zelda franchise. One of the unused pieces of concept art showed off depicted a floating island with Ganondorf standing atop of it. Though it never appeared in Breath of the Wild, this idea might not go unused after all. In the trailer for Breath of the Wild's sequel, a clip shows part of the land, Hyrule Castle included, breaking off from the earth and rising into the sky. Another unused idea for the Zelda series comes from Charles Martinet. the voice of Mario. Martinet once asked Shigeru Miyamoto whether he could also be the voice of Link. Miyamoto reportedly responded, "Link isn't going to have a voice, he's going to stay the way he is." If Martinet was disappointed, he didn't show it, saying, "Of course, Mr. Miyamoto is always right. The way it works right now is the way it's supposed to be." Speaking of voice work, both Zelda the Wand of Gamelon and Link the Faces of Evil for the Philips CDI have unused audio warnings. The protagonists of both games will warn the player that the game disc might be dirty, and recommend cleaning it before continuing.
I think your game disc must be dirty. Try ending the game and cleaning your disc.
Fans of Nintendo might be aware of the iQ Player. It was a Chinese exclusive console that essentially existed as an alternative to the Nintendo 64 and used comparative hardware. Well, the iQ Player was finally cracked in April 2018, a full 15 years after its release. Inside, hackers discovered a never-before-seen Taiwanese ROM of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. This suggests that the iQ Player, and possibly also Ocarina of Time, were originally planned to be localized and released in the region.
Did you know, for every iconic Nintendo character like Mario, Link or Donkey Kong, there's a Nintendo character that was lost to time, scrapped before they even had a chance to shine? In this video, we'll be talking about a few of the more interesting and eccentric lost Nintendo characters, some that were cut from a game that was actually released, and others that went down with a game that was cancelled entirely. The first character we're talking about is actually unique in that they fall somewhere between those two categories. We have previously talked about a game called Diddy Kong Pilot. This was a Game Boy Advance title that got scrapped when Rare was bought by Microsoft and was later revived and reworked into Banjo Pilot. The game was shown off in 2001, and several screenshots of the game were sent out to video games news outlets like IGN and GameSpot. One of those screenshots showed Diddy, DK, Cranky, Dixie, Crunch the Kremling, K. Rool, and this unnamed Kong member on the character select screen. The character seemed to embrace several cultural stereotypes of white farmers in the American South, which led to fans dubbing them Hillbilly Kong and even Bumpkin Kong. Obviously, Diddy Kong Pilot was scrapped and reworked into Banjo Pilot, which left all the characters in the original game on the cutting room floor. But fans were curious about this Kong. All the other Kongs had been in a released title, and since Microsoft purchased Rare, it was now unlikely they'd ever see him in an actual game. One curious fan was DK Vine's Chad McCanna, who wrote into Scribes, a section of the Rare website where staff would respond to fan letters. Chad asked about the cancelled Kong and what his actual name was. Rare gave an official response saying, "Don't worry about it. He's being killed off now anyway." Although this was a pretty disappointing reply, DK Vine's persistence would eventually pay off. Almost a decade later, the site managed to get in touch with a Rare employee who dropped some details about the elusive Kong. The developer, whose identity was kept a secret, told DK Vine the hillbilly was known as Redneck Kong, and was a very short-lived idea from the designer of the project, sometime during the time that screenshot was obviously captured. Although fans finally had his official name, Redneck Kong was seemingly never playable. Redneck had a fleeting existence and isn't playable in any of the game's builds that have leaked over the years. The character was replaced by Candy Kong in later versions of the game before it was canned. The next character we're talking about is also from the Donkey Kong universe. After the re-release of Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy, some fans looked back through the game's pre-release media and noticed that a few elements shown off in magazines were absent from the final game. On DK Vine's forums, user MattDog1Million posted an image from Nintendo Power showing what's likely a Kong helper character wearing a hat. MattDog said, "This guy was never given a name, but by the looks of him, I'd assume he'd be a Big Ape City resident, so I call him City Kong, unless you guys have another name for him." Since this post, fans have also named the character Hat Kong and Commuter Kong, and a whole bunch of other names. But there's been no official word on what the character's actual name was, or their function in the game, and unless someone at Rare spills the beans, it seems likely it'll stay that way. The following lost character doesn't have any art to illustrate them, but a simple description of them will likely conjure up vivid imagery in your mind's eye. When the original Mario Tennis was created for the Nintendo 64, the game's developers Camelot introduced a new character to complement Wario and mirror the partnership Mario has with Luigi. We're of course talking about Waluigi. But this isn't the only character that Camelot proposed to Nintendo. They also threw around the idea of expanding the motif of having an evil doppelganger to Peach, giving her a sort of Waru-Peachy counterpart that was akin to Wario and Waluigi. This information comes from Nintendo's own Japanese website, where Camelot staff talked about pitching the idea. One developer said it was absolutely not cute, and looked something like Wario in a dress. I don't know, sounds pretty cute to me. Unfortunately for the team, the pitch was shot down by Nintendo. It seems that in the final game, Princess Daisy was added so that Peach had someone similar to pair up with. Our next character goes all the way back to when The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was still known as Zelda 64. This early version of the title was featured in several gaming magazines, showing off a Navulus Link and a few non-playable characters. One of those NPCs was a woman who never appeared in the final game. And according to one alleged Nintendo insider who spoke to the fansite Zelda Power, her name was Aria. Aria apparently served a similar purpose to Navi in the early game, giving players tips at various locations across Hyrule. It's also likely that her model was reused, and the various Aria models that Link spoke to were in fact completely different characters using the same assets. It's also believed she may have some connection to the Kuko lady in the final game, as both of their models have similarities in their dress. By some stroke of luck, Aria's model and animation data are still within the retail version of Ocarina of Time, where our sweet, beautiful Aria is simply labelled as Object Human. Fans tried to properly restore Aria's model for over a decade. Most attempts tried loading Aria's assets over adult Malon's actor data, since they appeared to be roughly the same shape. However, Aria's model is very archaic, and its associated data is actually closer to Mario 64's NPCs than models from Ocarina of Time. Most attempts to restore her were only partially successful, leading to distortions in the model and strange animations. It wasn't until November 2010 that Zelda hacker Spinout182 discovered how to load Aria's model and animations in the model viewer ZSartan. And this was further refined by Nicholas Vitale in 2011, who managed to get a fairly complete version of Aria working properly in-game. So, unless some earlier data from Zelda 64's development is found, this is probably about as close as we'll get to experiencing Aria from those early screenshots. Aria is followed up on our list by a character that went down with the game they starred in. M09 was a cyborg tasked with saving the world, and the protagonist of Project Hammer for the Nintendo Wii. M09 was created in 2050 when the Project Hammer experiment was conducted by an unknown scientist. Later in 2089, M09 was recovered and reactivated by a technician in order to help combat a global threat. The title was set in a future United States during a robot invasion, and players would use the Wiimote and Nunchuck to utilize M09 and his giant hammer. The game had a mission structure where players fight waves of robots building up to a boss battle at the end of each stage, similar to the Dynasty Warriors style games. Project Hammer was being developed by Nintendo Software Technology, or NST for short. Starting development in 2003, the game was finally shown off at E3 2006. Around the time of its reveal, many developers thought the game wasn't up to Nintendo standards. The US developers and Japanese management disagreed on how to improve the game, however, and the game wasn't shown publicly for several years. It was later reported that development resources had been shifted to other upcoming titles, and the game was cancelled in 2009 after Nintendo pulled its funding. For a brief time, the game was also being reworked into a title called Wii Crush, where M09 was seemingly cut from the equation and replaced with Mii characters. M09 at least got to show us what they could do in-game. But the next lost character wasn't so lucky. At Nintendo's 2013 E3 press conference, Shigeru Miyamoto took the stage and finally revealed Pikmin 3 for the Wii U. While the title's gameplay was being demoed, a piece of concept art popped up showing a cast of 4 characters. But the final game only had 3 characters in the landing crew, not 4. In the concept art, each character has a letter under their name. Alf has the letter A under him, Brittany has the letter B, Charlie has a letter C, and this unused character has a D under them. Since each letter corresponds to the first letter of the characters' names, it's thought that D may have had an actual name starting with D during development, but this was never revealed. Some fans have even speculated that D's name may have been Drake, and that when D was cut, some of his attributes were given to the talking ship, the SS Drake. But, as we've said, this is just speculation. It's also believed that D was cut because micromanaging 4 different characters at the same time was just too much for the player to handle, and the game was scaled back to having just 3 on your crew. The following character is another that got scrapped along with their game. Dorin the Dragon was the protagonist of Dragon Hopper, a Virtual Boy title being developed by Intelligent Systems and planned to be published by Nintendo. The game was shown off at Nintendo's Space World 1995 event, and later again at E3 1996, as well as in an issue of Nintendo Power. Dragon Hopper was an adventure title with a top-down perspective. It took place in a series of tower-like structures where Dorin leaps up or down to new platforms, with the Virtual Boy's 3D effect making the floors appear closer and further away. The game had light platforming and puzzle elements, and was reminiscent of A Link to the Past's multi-layered dungeons. The fan site Planet Virtual Boy sums up the game's story as such. Dorin, the Dragon Prince, lived a happy life in the magical kingdom of Celestia, until the king's power-hungry prime minister captured and jailed his family, the king, the queen, and Dorin's love, Diana. Pursued by soldiers, Dorin fled his home. As he ran away, he tripped and fell into a mysterious hole, landing in the land of Faerun. Now he has to get back to the surface and save Celestia. Despite Dragon Hopper apparently being finished, the game was never released due to the poor sales of the Virtual Boy system. Oh, what could have been.
Did you know? Wind Waker could have had a sequel on the Game Boy Advance. Davide Soliani is best known today as the director of Mario & Rabbids Kingdom Battle, as well as the guy who cried when Miyamoto acknowledged his hard work on the game. But Davide's connection to Miyamoto actually began 15 years earlier, when he heard the legendary designer was visiting his hometown of Milan, Italy. After spending several days investigating which hotel Miyamoto was staying in, Davide camped out 10 hours in the rain just to get a chance to meet him. When Wind Waker hit store shelves a year later, Davide loved it so much he spent a month developing a Wind Waker sequel on GBA. Nowadays, he's Ubisoft Milan's creative director, but back then he was a humble designer working on games like Rayman and Tomb Raider and didn't have nearly as much clout as he does today. So when he pitched a graphical prototype of Zelda to the managing and studio directors, they decided to kill the project before Nintendo ever got a chance to see it. Davide's partner on the Wind Waker sequel was Ubisoft artist Fabio Paghetti, who told us a little more about how the pitch was born and why it got axed. Paghetti said, "We were both in love with Wind Waker, and Nintendo handhelds were the major focus of Ubisoft Milan at the time, so Davide and I were wondering how Wind Waker would look on GBA. We were always talking and tinkering together about possible concepts and pitches for the studio, and this looked like such a nice fit. Eventually, I prepared this visual mock-up, and we also worked on some 3D test scenes, but we never got the opportunity to pitch the game to Nintendo. The idea of presenting it to Nintendo probably scared Ubisoft, but maybe the game exists in some other fold of the multiverse." According to Davide and Fabio, the prototype and videos they pitched unfortunately no longer exist, unless they're stuck on a hard drive somewhere, so all that remains is this single image. Davide and Fabio didn't know it, but Nintendo was working on a sequel of their own at the exact same time. Unfortunately, Nintendo's attempt was cancelled as well. When Wind Waker launched in 2002, its reception failed to live up to Nintendo's expectations, and the game only ended up selling half as many copies as Ocarina of Time. According to Wind Waker's director director Eiji Aonuma, his team spent the following year in the planning stages and early development for Wind Waker 2, but ultimately abandoned the idea of a cel-shaded sequel, primarily due to financial concerns. There are far more Zelda fans in the West than there are in Japan, and Nintendo of America made it clear that Americans wanted a more realistic Zelda, and something closer to Ocarina of Time. According to Aonuma, right after Wind Waker released, we were considering a toon-shaded sequel, but a year later we settled on a more realistic approach. I was told the toon shading gave the impression that Wind Waker was for a younger audience, and that it was alienating the older teenagers that made up most of the fanbase. After hearing that, I started to worry if Wind Waker 2 was something that would actually sell, so the only thing we could do was give the American market the Zelda they were asking for. In the 2016 hardcover publication The Legend of Zelda Art and Artifacts, designer-manager Satoru Takizawa provided a little more insight on the direction Wind Waker 2 was headed before its development changed course. He said the proposed setting for Wind Waker 2 was not on the sea but on land. The desire to depict Toon Link on a horse riding around the Great Plains was great. However, with his small stature and short arms and legs, it would have been difficult to make him look good on a horse. It wasn't like we could make an adult version of Toon Link, and that was about the time we heard that people were wanting a realistic-looking Zelda game again. Development was quickly redirected to be more in line with Ocarina of Time, and although Toon Link did eventually return on the Nintendo DS, he never got a chance to ride a horse on the big screen as Nintendo originally envisioned. After 3 more years in development, Twilight Princess released in 2006. It turned out Nintendo of America was right. Realistic Zelda sold more than twice as many copies as Wind Waker. Nintendo decided to capitalize on the game's success with a direct sequel, just like they'd done on the Nintendo 64. According to Miyamoto, the terrain created for Twilight Princess was vast. I really thought there was more we could do with it, so after we finished with the development of Twilight Princess, I talked to the staff about whether or not we could do a side story. With a big series like Zelda, we usually only release a new version every 3 to 5 years, but we thought it'd be great to make something for those people that really enjoyed Twilight Princess where they'd be able to keep playing in the same world. The Zelda team started pre-production on a Majora-style sequel, but the idea Miyamoto chose in the end was a small side story based on the Wii Zapper. The Zelda team was shocked when they heard Miyamoto's decision, as it meant killing all the big ideas they'd started working on. Some felt strongly he wasn't making the right call, so Miyamoto proposed a compromise. They'd make a prototype for the Zapper side story and have it playtested, and if the focus group didn't like it, the Zelda team wouldn't have to make the Zapper game. The focus group ended up loving the prototype, and the project ultimately evolved into Link's crossbow training. But Miyamoto's team kept pushing to make it bigger, so we ended up making a list of rules. The developers couldn't add anything unnecessary to the game's simple concept, and every stage had to be shorter than 3 minutes. There couldn't be any story cutscenes, and the game couldn't have any bosses. But his team kept pushing. According to Miyamoto, they kept bugging him to include boss battles, so he finally gave in and agreed, but said they could only make 1 boss. Despite Miyamoto's orders, they wound up making 2, the Dark Nut and the Stall Lord. The Zelda team was heartbroken when their ideas for a Twilight sequel ended up on the cutting room floor, but Link's crossbow training proved to be the right business decision. The game sold nearly 6 million copies, almost 2 million more than Wind Waker. Not everyone was happy with the side story, but crossbow training did have one very important fan, series producer Eiji Aonuma. He actually pitched a sequel with improved gameplay and online multiplayer, as he explained to Games TM in 2009. To tell you the truth, I actually wanted to create Link's crossbow training too. I thought we should do something more and better in the field of the first-person shooter, based on our experience making the first game. For example, I was thinking maybe we could intensify the multiplayer mode. The original was really just a solo game, but I thought we could add a true multiplayer mode with multiple users playing together over Wi-Fi. Nintendo's higher-ups didn't share Aonuma's enthusiasm, however, and told him he should focus on the main series. After his crossbow training 2 pitch was rejected, Aonuma got to work making a Majora-style sequel to Phantom Hourglass, which launched 2 years later as Spirit Tracks. Although most Zelda fans have played every mainline Zelda game, few have played Four Swords, which released alongside A Link to the Past on GBA. By connecting up to 4 GBAs together with link cables, friends could explore randomly generated dungeons cooperatively, but also competitively, as each player was ranked on total rupees collected. 2 years later, it was followed up with Four Swords Adventure, where each player used a link cable to connect their GBA to a GameCube. Everyone shared the TV, but if a player went off in their own direction, gameplay switched to their GBA screen. Partly due to the multiplayer hardware components, Adventures never managed to sell even 1 million copies. But shortly before the DS released in 2005, Miyamoto suggested the DS would make this hardware issue a thing of the past. He said, at the time of GameCube and GBA connectivity, you had to connect the system to 4 GBAs, so the price of entry was a bit high. However, the DS has 2 screens and Wi-Fi support, so we feel the threshold is a lot lower. We're thinking of bringing Zelda Four Swords to the DS. And in another interview, the game's producer Eiji Aonuma told Club Nintendo Nintendo, the Zelda team is already planning Four Swords for the Nintendo DS. This game will have a lot of connectivity and feature a lot of interaction between both screens. It will be interesting. But a year later, Aonuma backtracked on his previous quote, suggesting Four Swords DS turned into Phantom Hourglass during the game's prototype phase. The game's director Daiki Iwamoto eventually shed a little more light on how the Four Swords team ended up producing something completely different. They stated, "It was around May 2004, right after we finished Four Swords Adventures. The DS hadn't been released yet, and the game was in the experimental stage. We started by trying many ideas on how to use the stylus, and wanted to continue exploring the theme of connectivity between two different screens. Eventually Aonuma said, let's try something different. So we started to think about a new type of Zelda system, one that would become a standard for the DS. In the end, a third entry in the Four Swords series was never produced. But it's worth mentioning that the original GBA game got a remaster on DS called Four Swords Anniversary Edition, released in 2011 to celebrate the franchise's 25th birthday. The DS remaster added lots of updates and brand new content, including a single-player mode, wireless connectivity, and new stages based on Zelda 1, A Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening. The Anniversary Edition never got a physical release, and was only available for digital download for 5 months on DS, then for just 4 days on 3DS a few years later. As a result, it's been unobtainable since 2014, meaning most Zelda fans never got a chance to experience the Four Swords remaster. In 2009, rumors spread that Retro Studios was working on a Zelda game for Wii, but those rumors weren't proven until May 2020, when concept art was found on an ArtStation account for Sammy Hall, who previously worked at Retro Studios on games like Metroid Prime 3 and Donkey Kong Country Returns. According to Hall, the concept art was from a cancelled Zelda project that would have taken place in the bad timeline, the timeline where Ganon defeated Link at the end of Ocarina of Time. Instead of Link, the spin-off starred the last surviving male Sheikah, after the rest of the Sheikah were wiped out in a genocidal event. The last Sheik's journey was planned as an origin story for the Master Sword, and the plot used the Gerudo's 100-year birth of Ganon as a backdrop. Hall's notes reveal the project began in 2005 during the Wii era, but ended up being cancelled in 2008. Retro's post-apocalyptic Hyrule took some visual inspiration from Twilight Princess, while also introducing lots of brand new ideas. Concept art included enemy types labeled Clock Kids, as well as Deku Warriors, the Lord of the Swamp, and several designs that may be bosses. There was also the Dark Valoo race, creatures clearly connected to Wind Waker's Valoo. Some concept art was titled Autumn, implying a use of seasons, possibly inspired by Oracle of Seasons. According to Sammy Hall, it was very experimental stuff, but games in the Zelda universe have very weird stuff, and this game was setting out to be 10 times weirder. 3 days after his artwork was first spotted by Metroid fan site Shinesparkers, Hall gave IGN a brief statement explaining the game was still in pre-production when it got cancelled, adding it was mostly handled internally at Retro without much involvement from Nintendo HQ. According to Hall, the game was cooked up by 3 Retro leads, including Mark Pacini, the director of Metroid Prime 1, 2, and 3. But production came to a halt when all 3 of them quit Retro to start their own studio in April 2008. Just a few hours after he spoke with IGN, Hall's social media was deleted, and even his Patreon account got pulled down, making fans speculate Nintendo, or possibly Retro's legal department, were the ones who pulled the plug. Since then, anyone involved has been unable or unwilling to comment, and no further details have been made public. However, it's important to note that Sammy Hall uploaded all this concept art after finding it on an old hard drive, so it's possible that other Retro employees still have more artwork and documents that hopefully someday might find their way onto the internet, revealing more about the 3-year project. A few months after Link's Awakening was re-released with some updates on the Game Boy Color, Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto approached Miyamoto about remaking Zelda 1 in the style of Link's Awakening. Perhaps wanting to avoid a repeat of the CDI debacle, Miyamoto blew him off, but Okamoto refused to take no for an answer, threatening to produce a rip-off if Miyamoto didn't say yes. In a 1999 interview with German magazine Total, Okamoto explained how the Trilogy project came into existence. He said, "I especially like the Zelda on Famicom, but Nintendo just wasn't interested in translating it onto the Game Boy Color. So I told Mr. Miyamoto that I wanted to produce the game, but nothing ever came of it, so I had to threaten him." The magazine, probably shocked, asked him to repeat himself. "You threatened him?" "I said if Nintendo doesn't want to do it, Capcom will make an identical game, but just change the name of the game and all the characters." Then he asked if we wanted to develop the game legitimately. We immediately accepted. Eventually, a deal was struck that after the remake was complete, Capcom would follow it up with a trilogy of brand new games called the Triforce series. As producer, Okamoto was meant to supervise the remake's development, but ended up spending most of his time overseas, so the project was led by Capcom director Hidemaru Fujibayashi. If that name sounds familiar, it's because after the partnership between Capcom and Nintendo was dissolved, Fujibayashi was hired to work directly for Nintendo and later served as director on Breath of the Wild, and is currently directing its sequel. In many ways, Breath of the Wild was a reimagining of Zelda 1, but at the time, Fujibayashi wasn't as enthusiastic about remaking Zelda 1 as his boss Okamoto. The Capcom team felt Zelda 1 was too difficult for the modern generation of gamers, so they ended up scrapping the remake and skipping ahead to development of the Triforce series. According to Miyamoto, the Tale of Power was originally planned to launch in late 1999 and focus on action, followed up a few months later with the puzzle-based Tale of Wisdom, and then a few months after that, the trilogy would conclude with the Tale of Courage. All 3 games would be connected with passwords, so after completing one game, fans could continue their adventure in the next installment. It was expected that fans would play the trilogy in the order they were released, but they were being developed in a way that fans could play the games in any order they wanted. The Triforce series was initially planned to make use of the mobile system GB, a service that allowed fans to connect a Game Boy Color to the internet by using a cell phone adapter. Miyamoto said, "The original idea for those games was for them to be more episodic in content, and the development actually started with the notion of potentially trying to sell dungeons individually. Linking all 3 games together proved too much for the team, however, so Okamoto made more than just a call for help. He had to send out an SOS for Miyamoto to ride in on a white horse and save the trilogy from development hell. To get the project back on course, Miyamoto cut the series from 3 games down to just 2, and any ideas involving online features were thrown out as well. The games were temporarily rebranded as the Mysterious Seeds series, but in the end, the Tale of Power became Oracle Seasons, and the Tale of Wisdom became Oracle of Ages. After more than a year of delays, instead of releasing episodically, the games finally launched together in February 2001. Bits and pieces of the cancelled Zelda 1 remake found their way into Seasons. Both games have a western graveyard, and the first dungeon can be found inside a dead tree on a small island, and even the dungeons' internal layouts are similar. 6 of Seasons' dungeon bosses were also taken from Zelda 1. As for the Tale of Courage, also known as the Mystical Seed of Courage, it's impossible to know exactly how much made its way into Oracle of Ages and Seasons, but in addition to the online features, we do know a few more pieces of the puzzle that got left out. The 2 games that survived made use of magic items called the Harp of Ages and the Rod of Seasons, while concept art revealed in the Hyrule Historia suggests the last game in the trilogy was planned around the magic paintbrush, an item that would have taken full advantage of the Game Boy Color. The Oracle Nairu plays a central role in Ages, and Din stars in Seasons, while the 3rd game was originally planned to feature Furori. Since the game was never finished, Furori ended up with just a small token role in Ages and Seasons, essentially as a password clerk in the Hall of Secrets. Some websites claim that Capcom was also planning to remake Zelda 2 for the Game Boy Color, but we couldn't find any credible evidence to support that claim, even after talking to Okamoto himself. So it appears the idea of Capcom remaking Zelda 2 was nothing more than a rumor, but there has been some legitimate interest in remaking Zelda 2 over the years, not only from outside studios, but also from Shigeru Miyamoto himself. Miyamoto has gone on record more than once saying Zelda 2 was one of his biggest regrets, even referring to the game as a failure. So in the early 90s, he began working on a Super Nintendo remake with Zelda and Mario alumni Yoshiaki Koizumi. If the game made heavy use of polygons, it was probably running on the Super FX chip, a co-processor that allowed for incredibly advanced graphics for its time, powering both Star Fox and Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. The project was ultimately cancelled, but buzz surrounding a potential remake has continued to this day. Most recently in 2018, when Inti Creates CEO Takuya Aizu said Zelda 2 was his dream remake. Inti Creates is famous for breathing new life into old games and big IP belonging to other companies, like they did with Mega Man 9 and 10, and Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon. So we reached out to Mr. Aizu to ask what a Zelda 2 remake might look like with him in the driver's seat. Aizu told us, "If we were to start development right away, I think it would be very aware of its Famicom disk system roots. But if this dream remake were to happen a few years down the road, I think it would be made in a way that would be most suitable for players at that time using the best development techniques we have available at Inti Creates. But if you talk too much about your dreams, they cease to be dreams, so I think I'll leave it at that." He told us discussions with Nintendo hadn't taken place, at least not yet, so we took the liberty of sending our email directly to Nintendo in hopes that someday, Inti Creates might get the chance to add Zelda 2 to their long list of retro remakes. Did you know? There's over 30 known Super Mario games that never saw the light of day. In this video, we'll be going through them all, with some exceptions. We'll leave out games that were rumored to exist but have no reputable proof that they were real, like Mario Kart VB, a reputed Mario Kart game for the Virtual Boy, as well as games that were just earlier versions of release titles, like Super Mario RPG 2, an early title for Paper Mario. We'll also be leaving out games in the Donkey Kong franchise, unless they're related to the original DK arcade title which Mario first appeared in. But let's get to it, starting with a few recent discoveries. Data backups from Nintendo's archives have been leaking online over the past few years, and in July 2021, the 10th set of data from the Nintendo archives was leaked on 4chan, containing material such as the Wii SDK source code and various builds from Pokémon games. Deep within this data, however, was a document detailing 10 prototypes for the Nintendo Wii, 2 of which were based on Mario. The first prototype, Koopa Troopa Forest, was a top-down game where players avoid turtles by throwing stones and shooting bullets at them. The second, Mario FPS, is an FPS that takes place in Isle Delfino. Neither of these games have playable ROMs available and only exist as black and white photos found in the document. In that same leak, however, a spreadsheet mentions DDR Mario 2 for the Wii, presumably a sequel to Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix. The game was going to be developed by Konami and was listed as not started yet. It's unknown if any development on the game started, however it's worth noting that a Mario Mix sequel announcement was rumored in 2005, which we covered in our recent Mario Rumors video. While newly discovered titles are always fascinating, let's go back a bit, to the oldest game on our list. In 1982, less than a year after the release of the original arcade Donkey Kong, bedroom coders Wayne Westmoreland and Terry Gilman created a personal port of Donkey Kong for the TRS-80 model of computers. The TRS-80 was one of the earliest mass-market home computers. This made a fully functional TRS-80 port of Donkey Kong with all 4 levels that much more impressive. Despite being finished, the game would never release, as the duo couldn't get permission from Nintendo to publish it. But in 1995, Wayne Westmoreland released all of his titles to the public domain, including the final build of this unreleased port as an extra surprise. Another lost title is Donkey Kong no Ongaku Asobi, an educational game designed to teach young players about music. The game had 2 modes. One was Music Quiz, a memory game where Mario and Pauline hammered notes on a piano while Donkey Kong played music, and the other was Donkey Band, a karaoke game starring Pauline where players sing into the microphone on the second Famicom controller. Music Play would have been the 3rd title in the Famicom Play trilogy were it to be released in December 1983, coinciding with Popeye's English Play and Donkey Kong Jr. Math. In 2016, Ichiro Sakurada, once a developer at Hudson Soft, revealed on Twitter that there were 3 reasons why Music Play got scrapped. Its gameplay was weak, it took up too much space on the cart, and it used music from Japanese singer Seiko Matsuda, which Nintendo never had legal permission to use. After its cancellation, a sample cartridge containing a late build of Music Play was sent to Hudson during development of the Family Basic Interpreter. Since Hudson shut down in 2012, it's unknown where the cartridge is presently. From 1983 to 1984, Atari created the Atari Soft branding to publish games on competitors' home computers such as the Commodore 64 and Apple II. The brand mainly focused on conversions of arcade games such as Pole Position, Moon Patrol, and even Mario Bros. California-based developer Designer Software was contracted to create Mario Bros. Ports for the C64, VIC-20, Apple II, and DOS computers. All 4 of these ports were completed, but due to Warner selling Atari's consumer division to former Commodore boss Jack Tramiel in 1984, Atari Soft got discontinued and none of these ports were released. According to Designer Software programmer Jimmy Huey in a 2005 interview with Retro Gaming Times Monthly, Atari's quality assurance reported a giant list of bugs in his finished product, which seemed odd to him as he viewed the game as relatively bug-free. Jimmy theorizes that this could be a way to justify the cancellation. A cracked version of the Apple II port was leaked in the 80s and spread around via piracy, while Commodore 64 had a different unrelated port in the UK years later done by Ocean Software. Note that home computer versions of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. were also being developed by Atari Soft, but were also cancelled for the same reason. Atari was also planning to release Mario Bros. On the Atari XE computer, the final model in their line of 8-bit computers. The hardware used on these systems was identical to that of the then-new Atari 5200, so programmer Bob Merrill converted his 5200 work to the XE. Despite being shown off at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in 1983, the port would not see release until 1988 when Atari put out several titles that got previously scrapped. However, what released wasn't Merrill's game, but rather a completely new version created by Sculptured Software. It's unknown as to why Atari did this, but some have theorized that they may have lost the source code to the original port. Thankfully, a near-final prototype of Merrill's game was found and released on the internet by Atari enthusiast and preservationist Matt Reichert. In mid-1987, British game publisher Firebird attempted to pitch a Commodore 64 port of Super Mario Bros. To Nintendo. Developers Gary Liddon and Gary Penn created a demo in just a few weeks, with Liddon rebuilding the first level from scratch, while Penn eyeballed the graphics off a television. Impressed with their work, a developer at fellow UK publisher Telecomsoft contacted Nintendo to see if they wanted to work with Firebird. Nintendo said no, and the project got dropped. Interestingly though, Firebird also attempted a Mario clone for the Commodore 64 titled Crucial Brothers a few years later, albeit with different developers, but this did not go anywhere either. In September 1990, years before Doom's creation, id Software developers John Carmack, John Romero, Adrian Carmack, and Tom Hall attempted to port Super Mario Bros. 3 to DOS computers. The group, then known as Ideas from the Deep, or IFD, recreated the first level of Mario 3 from scratch and substituted Mario with Dangerous Dave, a character previously seen in Apple II titles by John Romero. This demo was jokingly referred to as Dangerous Dave in copyright infringement and was possible due to a unique scrolling technique Carmack created that redrew each changed tile every frame, rather than the entire screen. After spending 72 straight hours polishing up the demo, id sent a copy of the game to Nintendo of America for approval. As John Romero recalls, the prototype made its way to the company offices in Kyoto, where it got rejected, as they did not want their intellectual property on anything but their hardware. Nevertheless, Nintendo was impressed with their work. Not wanting to put their scrolling technique to waste, the technology would find its way to the next title by id, Commander Keen and Invasion of the Vorticons. A few copies of the demo were passed around the industry on floppy disk, and in July 2021, a copy was donated to the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, where it was safely preserved. One of the most mysterious games on our list is Mario's Planet Quest. In July of 2021, Andrew Borman, digital games curator at the previously mentioned Strong Museum of Play, uncovered a game called Mario's Planet Quest, listed on the resume of a former Software Toolworks developer. The only information given was that it was developed for the Super Nintendo and was an educational game similar to Mario's Time Machine, which the developer also listed on their resume. Given the title, it's a safe bet that the game would have revolved around Mario traveling to space and learning about the solar system, clicking on objects for more information. Software Toolworks composer Mark Knight lists a similar game on his website called Mario's Mission Earth, which is likely the same game as the one uncovered by Borman. Super Mario's Wacky Worlds was a platform game developed by Nova Logic for the ill-fated Philips CDI console. Planned as a successor to Super Mario World, the game follows Mario as he treks through jungles, castles, cities, ancient Greece, and ancient Egypt. As you can see from the unfinished prototype that was dumped online, the game is very rudimentary, with Mario being unable to swim, collect power-ups, or be hurt by enemies. Comanche developer Nova Logic made an early one-level demo of the game in under 2 weeks, with programmers Silas Warner of Castle Wolfenstein fame and John Brooks leading the project. After getting approval from Philips, the group continued their work, aiming to create something that stayed true to the series. However, due to several staff leaving the company and the poor sales of the CDI, Wacky Worlds was scrapped. In an interview with researcher Frank Gasking for the book The Games That Weren't, Nova Logic artist Nina Stanley said, "I think the real reason that Wacky Worlds was cancelled was due to changes in personnel. The lead engineer on the project, John Brooks, decided to leave and work for EA. When a replacement programmer wasn't found to continue the project, I also left and went to EA, and the game was ultimately cancelled." According to Stanley, around 80% of the art and 30% of the programming were completed before production halted. At least 4 prototypes of Wacky Worlds are known to exist, with one being sold on eBay in 2002 for over $1,000. Another unreleased game for the CDI is Mario Takes America. Around 1994, Toronto-based developer Sigum Entertainment pitched an educational title starring Mario to Philips, where he traveled across the United States to learn more about places like New York, Niagara Falls, and Hollywood. The game would have featured live-action FMV of these locations, with a 2D Mario rendered over it Roger Rabbit style. The live-action backgrounds took up most of the game's memory, making it a hard project for the programmers, one of which reportedly left Sigum fewer than 3 weeks after being hired. While doing research for this video, Did You Know Gaming was able to get in touch with animation director Michael Borthwick, who told us a little more about the game's production. Borthwick told us, "Many sequences were done, but it was taking very long to get things working properly as the machine really could not handle what we were trying to do." SIGM founder Howard Greenspan likely failed to realize the limits of the machine right off the bat and kept over-promising the look and playability of the game to Phillips. For example, we had a full 12-frame Mario walk cycle that had to be reduced to 6 frames because the CDI player could not handle playing 12 frames plus video plus collision detection plus the other sprites. Late in development, SIGM tried creating a backup game that replaced Mario with Sonic the Hedgehog. A second backup game was also made with 2 original characters, a rock and roll duo named Heavy and Metal. Not impressed by their work, Phillips cut all funding, and the game was quickly cancelled. SIGM would file for bankruptcy in 1994, and most of the company's assets were repossessed by the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. Around late 1994, Argonaut Software pitched a 3D platforming game for the Super Nintendo titled Yoshi Racing. An unidentified artist at the company created a non-playable demo of the dinosaur running around an obstacle course, which would have used the same super effects technology seen in games like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX. Argonaut co-founder Jez Sand sent videos of the demo to Nintendo hoping for approval, but much to his dismay, they got rejected. Along with the recent cancellation of Star Fox 2, this response is considered a stake in Argonaut's departure from the company. A few years later, Nintendo would come out with a 3D platformer of their own, Super Mario 64. In a 2013 Eurogamer article, Sand alleged that Nintendo borrowed the 3D platforming concept from Argonaut, claiming that Shigeru Miyamoto thanked him for the idea at a trade show. It is unknown how accurate this claim is, as no one other than Sand and Miyamoto would be able to confirm it. In 1997, Argonaut released an original 3D platformer for Windows, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn, Croc, Legend of the Gobos. Rumors have circulated that Yoshi was the inspiration for Croc's design. Lead designer Nick Cusworth refutes this, saying that Croc's appearance came from a series of doodles by Argonaut IT member Simon Keating. In July of 2020, shortly following the infamous Nintendo Giga leak on 4chan, a single Super FX model of Yoshi was found deep within its files. Contrary to popular belief, this model had zero relation to Yoshi Racing and was likely used for a different project entirely. At the 1995 Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, a tech demo was unveiled for the then-new Virtual Boy, called Mario Bros. VB. The single-level demo had 3 different modes: a side-scroller where you could move between the background and the foreground like in Virtual Boy Wario Land, a top-down dungeon section similar to the Legend of Zelda series, and a mini-game identical to the original Mario Bros. Arcade title. Despite receiving high praise at the show and getting good coverage in magazines like GamePro and EGM, Mario Bros. VB never got shown again. It's unknown as to why the game was cancelled or if it progressed any further than the CES demo. Some have theorized that the demo eventually evolved into Mario Clash for the Virtual Boy, but this is yet to be confirmed by Nintendo. In 2016, video game preservation website Nintendo Player released an article discussing an odd concept art piece from their collection. The art was a 5-panel storyboard of Mario running through what looked like to be ruins of a building. Mario steps over a stone slab, which suddenly sprouts eyes and legs, turning into a womp-like creature. Little was known about the storyboard until Nintendo Player tracked down the original owner to a man named Patrick Michael Clark, former lead artist at the now-defunct Redmond-based Boss Game Studios. After contacting another dev at Boss Game, Nintendo Player confirmed Patrick's board was drawn in the mid to late 90s for a pitch that died on the vine after Nintendo saw the concept art. Following this failed project, Boss Game Studios would begin making third-party games for the Nintendo 64, including Top Gear Rally and Stunt Racer 64. The company shut its doors in 2002, following issues finding publishers for their future titles. Years before the Game Boy Advance, there was a Game Boy successor in the works codenamed Project Atlantis. Nintendo collaborated with Advanced Risk Machines, or ARM, to develop a 32-bit handheld that reportedly used a 160 MHz processor, 4 buttons, and a color LCD screen. In the April 1996 issue of EGM, news of the system was followed by a rumor that Nintendo was working on a game called Mario's Castle, potentially the Atlantis' launch title. However, other than this single blurb in EGM, no mention of Mario's Castle exists publicly. Even if it did exist, it's unlikely that any work was done on it aside from a few rough ideas on paper. Masato Kuwahara, project leader on the DSi, revealed in a 2009 Game Developers Conference talk that Nintendo wasn't satisfied dissatisfied with Atlantis' graphics performance and so scrapped the project entirely. Mario's castle did not get referenced during the Kuwahara-san GDC discussion, which further supports the theory that production did not go very far, or perhaps even start. One of the few cancelled games starring Mario's arch-rival Wario would be Wario Pool for the Game Boy Color. In 2001, veteran British developers Nick Pelling and Jeff Ferguson pitched a pool billiards game to Nintendo featuring the titular antihero. Little was known about the pitch until Pelling released a short video on his website, giving us a small glimpse of the game's plot. Late one stormy night, Wario receives a phone call from his manager asking if he'll be in the yearly pool championships. Wario says no. Suddenly, two literal pool sharks appear on TV, scoffing that nobody, not even Wario, can beat them at pool. Now furious, Wario decides to join the championships. According to Nick Pelling, despite getting rejected by Nintendo, the Wario Pool engine wasn't wasted. It was retooled and used for the Game Boy Color game 3D Pocket Pool, released only in Europe. Mario Artist Soundmaker was planned as the fifth entry in the Mario Artist series for the N64 disk drive, the console's Japanese-only add-on. Developed by the Manchester-based studio Software Creations, Soundmaker was originally bundled with Mario Artist Paint Studio as a single product. However, due to political infighting between Nintendo of America and Nintendo HQ in Japan, the game split in two. While Paint Studio had a Japanese release in December 1999, Sound Studio would never see store shelves. The game was likely canned due to 64DD being a commercial failure, and probably only went as far as a few bare-bones prototypes. An August 1999 article from IGN reported that an unrelated game also called Soundmaker was being planned alongside three additional titles: Game Maker, Video Jockey Maker, and Graphical Message Maker. Contrary to popular belief, none of these games had any connection to the other Soundmaker, or the Mario franchise in general. These were actually a part of a Maker series for the 64DD by developer Randonet. Another planned game for the 64DD would be Super Mario 64 2. Believed to be started around August of 1997, Shigeru Miyamoto and several other Mario 64 team members began working on a co-op system where Mario and Luigi were controlled by a single player, much like Olimar and Louie in the Pikmin series. This idea was inevitable, as a similar split-screen system was briefly tested during the first Mario 64. According to Miyamoto, a functioning co-op prototype was created, but got put on hold to focus on the upcoming Zelda 64. However, after Zelda's production went on much longer than expected, it was made clear that Mario 64 2 would be a late release on the N64 if it were to continue development. In a November 1998 interview with Nintendo Power Source, Miyamoto remarked, "Well, for over a year now at my desk, a prototype program of Luigi and Mario has been running around on my monitor. We have been thinking about the game, and it may be something that could work on a completely new game system." Miyamoto's decision to redo the project from scratch would result in a tech demo for the Nintendo GameCube. This was the start of Super Mario 128, a game so infamous that we've already written an entire video on it. Directed by Yoshiaki Koizumi, a demo was unveiled at Space World 2000 that showed a large 8-bit Mario sprite spawning smaller Marios until the numbers of characters on screen reached 128. The mini Marios would move around a saucer-like plane, interacting with random objects as well as each other. Although Mario 128 was never intended for commercial release, the demo's rapid generating element would find its way to another GameCube game. As said by Miyamoto in a 2007 GDC speech, "The one question I'm always asked is, what happened to Mario 128? The purpose of that demo was to show how the new technology in the GameCube could dynamically change the nature of Mario games. So when people ask me what happened to it, I'm always at a loss as to how to answer it, because most of you have already played it. But you played it in a game called Pikmin." In the same speech, Miyamoto revealed that Mario 128's sphere-walking gravity mechanic would be implemented in an upcoming game for the Nintendo Wii. That game was Super Mario Galaxy, which was also directed by Yoshiaki Koizumi. When the Game Boy Advance was publicly unveiled at GDC on April 10, 2000, it was presented alongside two tech demos. One, a game where you controlled a baby dolphin across the ocean, and two, a one-level remake of Yoshi's Story for the Nintendo 64. The demo included a new FMV intro and excluded elements from the original game like Yoshi's ability to use his tongue and shoot eggs. While it was received positively, and even featured in some early GBA advertisements, the remake never saw release. It's unknown if Nintendo ever planned to do that in the first place. Two ROMs of Yoshi's Story GBA, plus their source code, were found within the handheld's SDK, and both are now safely preserved. Another unreleased tech demo for the GBA is Mario Kart XXL. In 2004, Denaris Entertainment Software, a Germany-based developer founded by Turrican creator Manfred Trenz, created a Mario Kart prototype as a pitch for Nintendo. The game was impressive with parallax scrolling and 3D graphics, but was unfinished due to the inability to pass laps, collect coins, and stop at walls. As per usual, the pitch got rejected for reasons unknown. In 2005, the company released a GBA port of Crazy Frog Racer, which used a seemingly similar engine as Mario Kart XXL. Perhaps this game has a small remnant of the demo within it, but it's hard to know for sure. A prototype cartridge was revealed in 2015 by a collector in the Netherlands, but it is yet to be released online as of this video. And this isn't the only vehicular game on our list. Information on the DS's Mario motors is few and far between. During a conference at Reboot Developer 2018, Yuji Saito, a veteran game designer best known for games like Odema and Seaman, revealed that he pitched a DS title to Miyamoto and Satoru Iwata about creating motor engines. Inspired by Saito-san's love of sculpting, the game would have the player, presumably as Mario, shave a metal chunk into the shape of a cylinder to create an engine. One mechanic in the game was to have the player breathe into the DS to teach them about acceleration, but this got scrapped as they thought it caused children to get out of breath. During the conference, several images of the design document were shown, one of which shows Mario working on the engine alongside an older scientist-type character, possibly a relative to the plumber. When asked why the title was never released, Saito said, "I cannot tell you why, but please guess." Before making the Metroid Prime series, Retro Studios worked on a football simulator game for the GameCube. Beginning preliminary development in the summer of 1999, the original design was a Mario-themed family-friendly sports game a la Mario Tennis. According to programmer Jason Hughes, Nintendo wanted to capture a mature audience with the GameCube and suggested the game's Mario theme be dropped entirely. Development would resume in a more serious path, replacing Nintendo's characters with realistic players motion captured by the Dallas Cowboys. Originally intended as the exclusive football title for the GameCube, it became apparent that companies like Sega and Electronic Arts would be bringing their football games to the system, thus creating fierce competition. Retro Studios attempted to restart the game from scratch with a team of new designers, but they decided the better option was to cancel the game altogether. Despite having, among other things, fully functional networking support, a replay system, and a stadium renderer, the team dissolved in February of 2001, and development was halted indefinitely, never to resume. The football game would not be the only scrapped Mario game by Retro Studios. In May of 2020, concept art for a spin-off game starring Boo was found on the resume of artist Sammy Hill. Sammy, who had previously worked at Retro Studios on games like Metroid Prime 3, revealed on his now-defunct ArtStation profile that the title, codenamed Haunt, was planned for the Nintendo DS around 2006 to 2007. As we can read from the concept art, the game potentially revolved around a young Boo student fresh out of Haunt University. During graduation, Boo gets dipped in a mysterious green goop, which grants him special powers. Using these powers, Boo goes out to fight off witches, zombies, and piranha plants. In an interview with IGN, Hall revealed that the design for Haunt came from ex-Retro Studios leads Mark Pacini, Todd Keller, and Kynan Pearson, but got cancelled the week they went to create their other studios. Days after this interview was published, Hill's social media was mysteriously deleted. While we have no definitive answer for what happened, it's probably safe to assume there were some NDA-related issues. Super Mario Spikers is one of the most well-documented games on our list. Pitched by Next Level Games for the Wii, the title was first designed as Mario Volleyball, but quickly evolved to include elements of wrestling. It soon got renamed to Super Mario Spikers, which was a play on the soccer game Super Mario Strikers for the GameCube. As we can see from leaked concept art and animations, Spikers would have taken place on the set of a game show where Mario characters compete against each other. The winning team would move up to a grander location, such as Donkey Kong Island. Note that the game went for a more violent approach by Mario standards, with characters able to stomp on and throw other players across the area. According to an anonymous Next Level artist, Nintendo disapproved of the project as they believed the violent gameplay did not match the company code of honor. An early prototype of Spikers may still exist, but it's unlikely that that one will ever surface. 7 years before the release of Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, Ubisoft Paris attempted a similar crossover game between the franchises. In an interview conducted by fellow Digino gaming researcher Liam Robertson, an anonymous Ubisoft developer revealed the company formed a subversive, self-aware take on the Mario franchise where the Rabbids Rabbids wreak havoc on the Mushroom Kingdom. Sadly, for reasons unknown, Nintendo rejected the game before a formal pitch happened. All that remains is a single piece of concept art, which shows the Rabbids carrying Bowser away while Mario chases after them. According to Kingdom Battle director Davide Soliani, this pitch had no relation to the 2017 Nintendo Switch game. Did You Know Gaming attempted to reach out to Soliani for more information, but he couldn't share any additional details without permission from Ubisoft HQ. In November of 2018, Tesla founder Elon Musk was asked on Twitter if the company could add a Mario Kart game to their cars, one where players could race against other Tesla owners while both of their vehicles charge. To the user's surprise, Musk replied, "We tried. Nintendo would not license it to us." Considering that Musk is an avid gamer that even included an Atari emulator with some Tesla models, this idea was not that far-fetched. While he didn't specify why Nintendo said no, some have theorized that the Big N had safety concerns. There's a high chance that a driver could be badly injured while playing Mario Kart in a car, and that's something Nintendo would not want their brand associated with. On April 13th, 2013, Nintendo released a sizzle reel promoting the Wii U Virtual Console, including a port of the NES puzzle game Yoshi's Cookie. It never came out. No one knows why.
This is Japanese scriptwriter and novelist Takeshi Shudo. Shudo was the head writer for the first 5 years of the Pokemon anime, as well as the first 3 Pokemon movies. His creative process was fueled by alcohol and tranquilizers, and in the last 2 years before his death, he became obsessed with the only Pokemon he ever created, Lugia. The full story behind the diving Pokemon's creation is a long and complicated story involving substance abuse, seizures, and contributions from just about every corner of Pokemon bureaucracy. To get the full picture, Did You Know Gaming searched through hundreds of Shudo's Japanese blog posts and translated everything he ever wrote about Lugia, along with some leaks and several other key documents. But before we dive into Lugia's bizarre origin story, let's talk about where Lugia wasn't created, at Game Freak headquarters. In retrospect, it almost seems inevitable that Lugia would appear in Pokemon's second generation, especially since Lugia's place as Silver's box legendary is nothing short of iconic. But Lugia's inclusion in Gen 2 wasn't originally part of the plan. The earliest builds of Pokemon Gold and Silver were shown to the public only once, at Space World 1997, an E3-style gaming expo held in Japan exclusively for Nintendo products. Gold and Silver's 1997 demos were very different to the game's final build, taking place in a region based on the entirety of Japan, and containing lots of Pokemon that eventually got cut from the game's final build. But after the expo, Nintendo and Game Freak locked those demos away in their vaults forever, leaving fans around the world wondering about all the secrets and lost Pokemon inside. It was one of gaming's biggest mysteries for over 2 decades, that is until 2018, when a hacker going by the pseudonym Wacko broke into Nintendo's servers and stole tons of development assets. Before getting arrested, the first thing they leaked was the now legendary Space World demo. Fans marveled at all the newly found lost Pokemon, but one very important Pokemon was missing from the Pokedex, Lugia. Later leaks stemming from the same hack revealed that Lugia's first appearance in Gold and Silver's development was dated June 1999. According to Shudo, that's because it wasn't Game Freak who created Lugia, it was him. He came up with Lugia specifically for the second Pokemon movie, which released 1 month later in July 1999. When he created Lugia, Shudo originally thought it'd remain exclusive to the film. In fact, he was actually surprised when it appeared in the games at all. Toward the end of his life, Shudo wrote on his blog, "Since Lugia was a Pokemon I designed myself solely for the new movie, I was surprised it ended up getting used later in the games and TV show. Actually, I thought of Lugia as a Pokemon exclusive to the movies." By modern standards, Shudo's expectation that Lugia would be a theater-exclusive Pokemon seems absurd. Of course it found its way into the games, but this was still early days for the franchise, and series standards were still being formed. And even knowing what we know today, it's worth pointing out that there are still Pokemon forms that appear in official media but never made their way into the mainline series, like Mecha Mewtwo from Pokemon Live, Primal Dialga from Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, and of course Shadow Lugia from Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. Gold and Silver's development began as soon as Red and Green were finished, with Game Freak originally saying Gen 2 would release in 1997, but their release date ended up getting delayed by a full 2 years, and according to Shudo, if it wasn't for that massive delay, Lugia's inclusion in Gold and Silver would have been impossible, which raises an interesting question. If that 2-year delay never happened, which Pokemon was originally planned as Silver's mascot? More leaks from the Wacko hack have since revealed an even earlier proto-Pokedex, in which Ho-Oh, Unknown, and a third Pokemon were all grouped together. This lost Pokemon ultimately got scrapped, but it appears to have been based on Shushu from Chinese mythology, also known as lion dogs. In China, they're considered guardians, and Shushu statues are often placed at the entrances of imperial palaces, temples, government offices, and the homes of the wealthy. Ho-Oh is clearly based on the Chinese phoenix Feng Huang, which suggests this pair of Chinese-inspired legendary beasts may have been the two Pokemon Game Freak originally planned for Gold and Silver's box art. The developers themselves never commented on the leak, however, so that's all just a theory, and you'd do well to take it with a grain of salt. With the sole exception of Lugia, every other Pokemon was made in-house by Game Freak designers, and it was a unique situation that allowed Shudo, the writer of the anime and movies, the opportunity to make a Pokemon of his very own. In fact, it was only possible because of a tragedy that took place in late 1997, what fans now call the Pokemon Shock. The anime's 38th episode, Cyber Soldier Porygon, contained a series of flashing red and blue lights that sent hundreds of Japanese kids into fits of seizures, and hospitalized almost 700 people. In the wake of the tragedy, every Pokemon episode was pulled from the airwaves, and Pokemon executives scrambled to deal with the situation, fearing it could result in the end of Pokemon altogether. So, with all his bosses distracted, Shudo took advantage of the situation to make the first Pokemon movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, into a much darker film than his bosses would have otherwise allowed. Shudo says his bosses would have stopped him if they had the chance, but after Mewtwo Strikes Back broke box office records and became the highest grossing Japanese film to ever release in America, Shudo was given near total creative freedom to write the second Pokemon movie, and the first thing he did was crack open a bottle of booze. After retiring from the Pokemon franchise, Shudo admitted on his personal blog that he relied heavily on alcohol and pills to write both the Pokemon anime and the movies. He talked about it a lot, but just to illustrate the extent of it all, here's just one example of the sort of thing he was writing. If I can't drink, I take tranquilizers. Of course, the ones you can normally buy in a pharmacy, not illegal substances. When I get a little bit high, it helps me sort out all my confused thoughts. However, when it comes to alcohol and drugs, you need to know your limit. Like, if I start to think that 1 + 1 doesn't necessarily equal 2, when these become difficult, it means I'm drunk. If I get any more intoxicated after that, I won't be able to think productively, and there's also the danger of tripping somewhere and hurting myself. Shudo makes it undeniably clear he was under the influence pretty much the entire time he was working on the Pokemon franchise, and went into particular detail about his intake while he was writing the Pokemon second movie. So it's fair to say that Lugia wasn't just a result of the Pokemon Shock, but it was also born out of Shudo's substance abuse. Even before Shudo came up with the movie's plot, the first ideas he came up with were two main characters: the Collector, who went on to become Lawrence III, and what he called Pokemon X, a placeholder name for what eventually became Lugia. This is why, when Lugia later appeared in the anime, Dr. Namba refers to Lugia as Pokemon X.
What action do you want them to take regarding the mysterious Pokemon X?
According to Shudo, X was supposed to be a creature different from Pokemon, since it had to symbolize life for humans too. It's a symbol of life, but also a symbol of coexistence. Originally, Pokemon didn't have genders, but X symbolizes deep ocean currents and created life on Earth. It's a maternal Pokemon. Shudo originally wrote the movie based around Pokemon X, and purposefully excluded series regulars like Ash, Pikachu, and Team Rocket. He wasn't particularly fond of Ash, and wanted him written out of the anime, but Shudo's subordinate units asked him to inject Ash into the script anyway, which he eventually agreed to as a way of showing his willingness to compromise. Pokemon X finally got an official name during an all-hands-on-deck production meeting. Staff from every corner of the franchise attended, including staff working on the film, Game Freak employees, and even distribution staff. Everyone in the meeting voted, and the winning name, of course, turned out to be Lugia. The most likely inspiration for its name is Lugio, a Latin word that means to lie dormant, probably chosen because the first time Lugia is ever seen by the public is 5 minutes into the film when it's lying dormant deep under the ocean. The name might also draw partial inspiration from the beluga whale, which Lugia bears some resemblance to. Lugia's role in the story has some parallels with the Great White Whale in Moby Dick, with Lawrence playing the part of Captain Ahab, but it's unclear if that was actually Shudo's intention. As far as lore inspiration, Shudo may have drawn from Japanese mythology's god of the sea, the benevolent dragon Ryujin. Not only does Lugia resemble a wyvern dragon, but in the Japanese version of the movie, Lugia is also called the god of the sea. Lugia has the power to summon storms, as does Ryujin, like when he used a hurricane to repel a fleet of Mongolian ships invading Japan. The Ryujin connection was eventually made even stronger with Lugia's shiny colors, which match those of Ryujin's legendary underwater castle. One key difference though is that while Ryujin is a male god, Shudo specifically created Lugia as a female god. But unfortunately for Shudo, Lugia ended up resembling Ryujin a little bit more than he might have intended. He created Lugia as the maternal symbol of life and deep ocean currents, but like many Pokemon, after coming up with the creature's concept, the details were out of the creator's control. Not just Lugia's name, but also its voice and gender. He felt strongly that as a maternal god, Lugia should have been voiced by a female actress, but the film studio went against his wishes and chose a male actor instead. In the final year of his life, Shudo wrote at great lengths about the anguish this caused him. Here's just a few excerpts from his final months. One of the regrets I have about writing the second Pokemon movie was that I didn't push back on the gender assigned to Lugia. Although its gender isn't addressed in the plot, it's given a male voice, but it's a maternal Pokemon. To make matters worse, using a male voice actor for Lugia was a decision made during a big meeting with many participants. Advertisements had already aired. It was too late. We couldn't suddenly change Lugia into a female. But the more I thought about it, the less I could imagine X being anything else but female. I was gulping down alcohol and drugs. I started to feel like I wanted to die. Not only was Lugia voiced by a man, but it was made genderless in the games. Shudo wrote a lot about Lugia in the year before he died, but it was the loss of its maternal identity that pained him most. In late 2010, he collapsed in the smoking room of a train station and was rushed to the hospital, but tragically didn't survive. The cause of death was a subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is essentially a brain bleed whose risk factors include cigarettes and alcohol. It was Shudo's substance abuse that fueled his writing and gave birth to Lugia, but sadly, it may have also been what killed him. This brings us to the end of Shudo's story, but it's far from the end of Lugia's. To continue, we need to rewind back to Gen 2's development. The first Lugia beta sprite ever found is dated back to a month before the second movie landed in Japanese theaters. It looks nearly identical to Lugia's final design, but has 6 dorsal spines instead of the 10 on the finished sprite. But there's an even older beta sprite dating back to the Shushu period that may have been an even earlier form of Lugia, an unnamed boat Pokemon, now known only by its proto-Pokedex number 344. Just like Lugia, 344 appears to draw partial inspiration from plesiosaurs, a type of marine reptile that went extinct 65 million years ago, along with the dinosaurs. Some of its physical details are similar as well, especially its dorsal design, long neck, and its tail, which has led some fans to speculate that after Shudo came up with the Pokemon X concept, Game Freak might have used 344 as a springboard to come up with a brand new design that ultimately became Lugia. As an apparent non-legendary, some fans also believe 344 may have been evolutionary related to 2 other lost Pokemon from that version of the Proto-Dex. However, since that particular leak lacked evolution production data, and the developers themselves have never commented on those lost Pokemon, any relation between Lugia and 344 is entirely speculative. It's unclear if Shudo made any sketches himself, and as a matter of fact, in 2009, Shudo said he doesn't know who all was involved in the design process. However, we do know who to credit for Lugia's final design. Like all Gen 2 Pokemon, Game Freak's art director Ken Sugimori made Lugia's final revisions, and drew the watercolor artwork that became its official design. Although it's worth pointing out that even after Lugia landed on the silver screen, which by the way became the second highest earning Japanese movie to ever hit American theaters, there was one significant detail that wasn't truly cemented until almost a decade later. In the movie, Lugia was white with blue spikes, and its in-game sprites were white and blue as well. But Ken Sugimori actually released two contradictory pieces of watercolor artwork during Gen 2, one with blue spikes and another with black spikes. After that, Lugia's sprites switched to black in Gen 3 as well as in Gen 4's beta, but finally in Gen 4, the sprites switched back to blue spikes. This was also the case with Lugia's Gen 4 artwork, and after that, it was never seen with black spikes ever again. There's also the question of Lugia's elemental type, a topic that's caused some confusion ever since its inception. Neither the film or Shudo himself ever directly addressed Lugia's type, although presumably when Shudo created the God of the Sea, he probably intended her as half water type. But when Game Freak went to program it into Gold and Silver, they ended up making it dual type Psychic and Flying. According to programmer and designer Shigeki Morimoto, who's best known as the creator of Mew, Lugia was made half Psychic simply because they wanted to make it strong. In the July 2009 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine, he said, "We wanted Lugia to give the impression of being a powerful Pokemon, so we settled on Psychic for the second type instead of water type." In other words, Lugia is not a water type, despite being underwater, because due to its flying type appearance and psychic type being the symbol of a powerful Pokemon at the time. For some extra context to what Morimoto is saying here, it's worth noting that psychics were so powerful back in the 90s that Mew and Mewtwo were banned from all 3 World Cups, and even after the ban, nearly half the Pokemon used by the finalists were all psychic types. But what about Shadow Lugia, or as it's known in Japan, Dark Lugia? It made its first, and as of the making of this video, its only appearance in the 2005 GameCube title Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. In the game, Shadow Lugia is referred to by its codename XD001, which some fans believe is a reference to its origins as Pokemon X. Weirdly, the Pokemon Company never actually said what XD stands for, so fans have been speculating for the past 15 years whether it's Extra Darkness, Extreme Darkness, or some other abbreviation. Did You Know Gaming got in contact with Tsukasa Tawada, the composer who created Shadow Lugia's theme, as well as all the music in both Colosseum and Gale of Darkness. He told us the XD actually stands for Extra Dimension, and when we asked if the developers intended XD001 as a nod to Pokemon X, he didn't seem to even know what we were talking about. Just like the original Lugia, its shadow form wasn't created by Game Freak. Both its concept and its design were made by Gale of Darkness's developers at Genius Sonority. Lugia was the only shadow Pokemon in the game to receive a unique design, whereas every other shadow Pokemon retained their standard appearance just with a purple haze. Shadow Lugia is often cited as the very first Pokemon ever designed by James Turner, the Englishman who eventually worked his way through the ranks to become Sword and Shield's art director. But just like the original Lugia, its dark side was really more of a team effort. According to James, Lugia was chosen as the star of the game by the writing team. He said he doesn't know why they chose Lugia, but presumably it's because Ho-Oh was the star of the Ore game that came before, Pokemon Colosseum. But James wasn't the guy who drew the first sketches either. It was the art director Hiromoto Shinichi, who's probably most famous as the illustrator of the Star Wars Return of the Jedi manga series. After Hiromoto hammered down the basic design, Shadow Lugia was finally handed off to James, who chose the colors and finalized the design. James also made Shadow Lugia's official art that appears on the box art, as well as the CGI cutscenes that featured Shadow Lugia. Shudo grew obsessed obsessed with Lugia, and similarly, James also had a great affection to Shadow Lugia. Both of them considered Lugia their baby in some sense. James calls it his dark child, and occasionally laments on Twitter that he'd love to see Shadow Lugia return someday. Unfortunately, the only way to transfer Shadow Lugia to a mainline Pokemon game is by purifying it, at which point it just becomes an ordinary Lugia, meaning Shadow Lugia is trapped forever on fans' GameCube memory cards. But now that James is working Game Freak proper and has a lot more clout as the art director, maybe someday we could see Shadow Lugia finally return to the series. In 2020, the Venusaur, Charizard, and Blastoise clones from Mewtwo Strikes Back made their way into Pokemon Go, so Shadow Lugia might someday make a comeback as well, even if it's only in a spin-off.
For every iconic Nintendo game like Super Mario 64, Super Metroid, or Pokemon Red and Blue, there's a horde of rumored Nintendo games that never actually existed. And while many of these rumored games can be boiled down to someone telling a lie on a message board, some of them have more interesting backstories. In this video, we'll be talking about a few of the more interesting and eccentric rumored Nintendo games. Some that were completely made up, some that were half-truths, and some that may have actually existed but can't be proven. And since Metroid Dread recently released on the Switch, we thought we'd start this video off right with a few rumored Metroid games. At E3 2017, Nintendo dropped a bit of a bombshell during their presentation. Metroid Prime, a sub-series that many thought had come to a close, was suddenly revived with a tease of Metroid Prime 4 for the Nintendo Switch. And if that wasn't enough, a few hours later Nintendo revealed that Metroid 2 was being remade for the 3DS by Mercury Steam. Fans knew that a Prime 4 release was still years off, and that Samus Returns was coming later that year. This drummed up a lot of speculation about what Nintendo might do to fill the gap between the two games, if at all. It seemed like a no-brainer that Nintendo would port the Metroid Prime trilogy to the Switch, and this was understandably a recurring rumor following the Prime 4 announcement. However, some leakers and rumor mongers went a step further than this, believing Nintendo had another remake in the works. In November 2019, a group of leakers named Leaky Pandy, who has previously been called Vandal Leaks, tweeted, "Nintendo is planning 2 new Metroid titles that will release in the next 2 fiscal years respectively. One is a re-release of Metroid Prime Trilogy HD, the second one is a Super Metroid remake that mimics Samus Returns in style and scope." While many were excited for a potential Super Metroid remake on Switch, others were more skeptical. A remake of Samus Returns on 3DS made a lot of sense. Metroid 2 would probably age the worst out of all the Metroid titles, and would benefit from a remake. Super Metroid, however, is still beloved and played by millions regularly to this day, and clearly wouldn't benefit as much from a remake. Some also pointed at the spotty history of Leaky Pandy's rumors. Although the group had correctly predicted a date for an August 2018 Nintendo Direct, and that gameplay for Travis Strikes Again would feature single Joy-Con co-op gameplay, many of their other predictions didn't come true, like Mario Odyssey getting a new Luigi's Mansion-based kingdom with a new 43 stars, and as the old saying goes, a broken clock is right twice a day. A new 2D Metroid was announced nearly a year and a half later as Metroid Dread, but the likelihood of the rumor and Dread being connected seems low. And this isn't the only rumored Metroid game we're talking about today. But before we get into more rumored Nintendo games, we'd like to talk about this video's sponsor, Mech Arena. If you love playing online with friends, you should try out Mech Arena. This third-person PvP mech shooter is free to play on iOS and Android, and has plenty of co-op and team play modes, perfect for playing in short bursts. This includes 2v2 and 5v5 matches, and even custom matches and tournaments. We found Mech Arena to be loads of fun, with the chaotic main Mech Arena map being where we spent most of our time. Practically all of the fighting happens in the stage's center, with only the cowards, opportunists, and most likely gaming trivia YouTubers skirting the edges. The game has tons of free loot via daily rewards, including its hottest new weapon, the disc launcher. You can even grab new mech skins in the game's events, like this month's extra special Halloween events. So if you want to play Mech Arena for free on Android and iOS, you can use our link or the QR code on screen to get yourself started with the Desert Digital skin, 200 A-coins, and 10,000 credits. And if you're quick, you can even add us as a friend using our player ID. Don't sleep on this great bonus. And now back to that other rumored Metroid game. In September 2011, Metroid Database posted a scan from a 1998 issue of Germany's Club Nintendo magazine. Club Nintendo seemed to be featuring a screenshot from a Game Boy Color version of Metroid 2, which fans have come to call Metroid 2 DX, in the same vein as Link's Awakening DX. Interestingly, the page never mentions Metroid by name, and it's not clear if the image is real or some kind of mock-up. The user who sent the scan to Metroid Database, Prime Blue, said that Club Nintendo rarely made mock-ups for games, and tended to only use official material. But there are several factors that indicate the image may be a mock-up and not a screenshot of an actual game. One of the reasons is that the alleged Metroid 2 DX image depicted an entirely new area not found in Metroid 2, and used a combination of enemies that can't be found in the game either. Comments from developers don't seem to back up the image either. In a 1998 interview, Nintendo of America localizer Dan Ausen didn't seem to recall the game existing, and just mentioned that the Game Boy Color had a Metroid palette built in. When asked about a Game Boy Color re-release of Metroid 2, Ausen said, "Since R&D 1 was involved in the development of Game Boy Color, I think they were able to put a special Metroid palette in the GBC hardware. This makes Metroid 2 look really nice on Game Boy Color." The game was also never listed as in development by Nintendo Power. Series developer Yoshio Sakamoto also stated that no Metroid titles were developed for the Game Boy Color because the system's limitations were closer to the original Nintendo. Any handheld Metroid game would have been technically very inferior to Super Metroid, and therefore would be compared to it unfavorably. Our next rumored Nintendo game is a little more recent, and will leave you thinking about what could have been. In June 2015, gaming historian and Did You Know Gaming collaborator Liam Robertson posted a video on his YouTube channel talking about a potential F-Zero title on the Wii U. Liam had been tipped off that Criterion Games was asked by Nintendo of Europe if the studio had any interest in working on the F-Zero IP. Criterion are responsible for the Burnout series, as well as several well-received entries in the Need for Speed franchise. Given the studio's familiarity with high-octane racers, it's understandable why Nintendo might approach them with an offer to work on F-Zero. Liam set out to see if he could confirm the rumor, and reached out to former vice president and creative director of Criterion Games, Alex Ward. Ward confirmed that the rumor was true, and that in early 2011, someone at Nintendo of Europe asked Criterion about doing an F-Zero game for the Wii U. At the time, Criterion was developing Need for Speed Most Wanted, and wasn't available for any new projects, and Nintendo wanted the game in production ASAP, with another source telling Liam that Nintendo wanted to show F-Zero off at the Wii U's unveiling at E3 2011. By the time Liam posted his video, it'd been over a decade since the last F-Zero title was released. Fans were clamoring for any news on the franchise, which led to several news sites picking up Liam's report, but many of them seem to have gotten the report completely wrong. Several outlets embellished the story, saying that an F-Zero title had been in development for the Wii U, but was cancelled. But the project, if you can even call it that, was never even formally pitched. This led to Ward playing down the rumors on the Game Informer show, where he said that the Nintendo representative who reached out to him about F-Zero was very junior, and implied this rep wouldn't have been able to even arrange a pitch. For our next rumored game, we're going back in time again, to an era where gaming rumors mainly came from magazines. One magazine that was quick to report rumors back in the day was Electronic Gaming Monthly. In their gaming gossip section, EGM's Quarterman would report a handful of rumors from the industry in every issue, and one of these rumors told of a brand new Mario and Donkey Kong game coming to the Super Nintendo. They went on to talk about how the game was a 16-bit remake of the arcade version of Donkey Kong with new scenes and better graphics. Although we've mentioned this rumor in a previous episode, what we didn't mention was EGM's follow-up over a year later. According to the outlet's June 1993 issue, the Mario and Donkey Kong title got further into development, but was, quote, placed on the Philips CDI and Super Famicom CD platforms. EGM also said the title was slated to come out sometime in the following year, which is notably optimistic for a game that was never released. That said, some part of this rumor may be true. Back in 1992 to 93, a company called RSP was developing games for the Super Nintendo and Philips CDI. This was a USA-based independent studio founded by Atari's Mike Rydell, who'd worked on titles like Spy vs. Spy and Commando. Another staffer at RSP was Adrian Jackson Jones, who worked as a Super Nintendo and CDI programmer. Although Adrian only spent a year at RSP, he'd later later add a curious game to his resume. According to Adrian, he designed and implemented the game engine for the CDI system game Donkey Kong. The fact that RSP was working on both Super Nintendo and CDI titles, and reportedly developed a DK CDI game around 1993, the same time frame as the rumor, could mean EGM's rumor was legit. And while we're talking about Donkey Kong, we might as well talk about another rumored DK title. One 8-bit Nintendo game, Return of Donkey Kong, is a unique example of a title that may just be a rumor, but could potentially be an unreleased project. In 1987, the official Nintendo Player's Guide listed an upcoming title in their coming attractions section as Return of Donkey Kong, the fourth installment of the arcade series where you'd get a hold of that barrel-throwing, mischief-making rascal and take control. Months later, in the March 1988 issue of Nintendo Fun Club, Nintendo's official newsletter from the 80s, a similar preview was made, hinting at the idea of Donkey Kong becoming a playable character. Despite being name-dropped in print on multiple occasions, there's no proof of whether the game existed or not. Several Nintendo employees, such as spokesperson Howard Phillips and executive VP Don James, have no memory of the game when asked about it. In addition to this, no screenshots of the game in action have yet to surface. A 1997 issue of the British N64 magazine claimed that Return of Donkey Kong was completed, but gave no sources to back it up, so take that with a grain of salt.